All right, Chairman, we are ready to go.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this July 8th, 2020 meeting of the North Carolina State Board of Education. I'm Eric Davis, Chair of the Board, and I call this meeting to order. I now welcome board members and advisors, staff, visitors, online listeners, and Twitter followers. For our visitors and those listening online, excuse me, if you could mute your line, it would help all of us hear better, please. Thank you. For our visitors and those listening online, our committee meetings and reports will span 2 days. Typically, our July meeting is a one-day meeting. However, to allow appropriate consideration of the slate of items we face, we amended our original calendar date for a 2-day July meeting. Tomorrow's meeting will include voting on any item needing action. Board members are reminded that it's our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this board. Does any member of the board know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. And if during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Before seeking a motion to approve the agenda, I'd like to return to my closing comments at the end of the June 4th, 2020 meeting. In my comments concerning the state information system procurement, I incorrectly stated that the June meeting was the first meeting that the board had received a report on this item. In fact, the board had received reports the previous 2 months. So I want to acknowledge that error and extend my apology to the many staff members who have been working on this procurement for many months prior to it coming before the board, and to thank you for the many more months of work ahead of us on this important procurement. Board members, you've seen the agenda for over a week and had the opportunity to review it, and I ask if there are any requests for changes to the agenda. If not, I request a motion for approval.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Wendell Hall, I make a motion that we approve the agenda as presented.
Motion by Mr. Hall for approval of the agenda. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by, is that Ms. Camden?
Ms. Camden.
Second by Ms. Camden. Dr. Townsend Smith, will you call the roll to capture the vote?
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton?
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Hall?
Yes.
Dr. Tipton Rogers? Dr. Tipton Rogers?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. White?
Yes.
Mr. Chasteen?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Lieutenant Governor? Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes.
It's unanimous.
Thank you. We have an agenda. I'd also like at this time to welcome Superintendent Dr. Tony Jackson as our new superintendent advisor. We will more formally recognize and welcome Dr. Jackson tomorrow, but we want to pause at this moment and extend our congratulations to you, Dr. Jackson, on your election as our superintendent advisor, and we welcome your expertise and advice in this meeting and in meetings ahead. We look forward to your remarks tomorrow.
Thank you.
About a year ago, 2 seniors, Mr. Miles Cyrus and Mr. Greer Webb, who graduated from our state's K-12 education system, stood before us using their voice to appeal to the board about the importance of student participation in state board meetings to inform our decision. When they appeared before us, student voice had been absent from our table for some time. Following that meeting, the superintendent initiated the process designated to him under statute and made recommendations for the senior and junior student advisors to assume the student advisor role. Ms. Gaskell, whose appointment expired last month, and Mr. Colt Tomberlin have provided invaluable insights to the board on many issues, including but not limited to considerations related to COVID-19. We appreciate and continue to need their perspectives each month. Today, we'll have an opportunity to hear student perspectives about schools and their individual experiences in our K-12 education system. I'm reminded of a statement from Mr. Webb, who stood before us and urged us to always ask students, as they are the reason why we serve and the primary beneficiaries of the decisions that we make. When we listen to our students, we become students ourselves, learning about the impact of our decision. We appreciate the Strategic Planning Committee's work, extending opportunities for students to speak to the board today. It's also worth noting that while it seems that every minute is consumed with the urgent effects of the pandemic, we continue undeterred in our strategic work, taking action to erase inequities and racism in our system. And we do so today by listening to our students. We will now proceed to today's committee work. A note to committee chairs and audience that all voting on consent and any item requiring action will be completed tomorrow via roll call. I now recognize Mr. James Ford, Chair of the Strategic Planning Committee. Mr. Ford.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I am James Ford, Chair of the Strategic Planning Committee, alongside my esteemed colleague, Ms. Jill Kamitz. And I consider it an esteemed pleasure to be able to introduce to you all, as the chair has so eloquently stated, the opportunity for us to become students and for the roles to be reversed, even if but for a moment. We're going to be hearing from one educator, consummate educator from out of Wake County Public Schools, Middle Creek High School, Mr. Matt Chaldon. I have to say I have the privilege of knowing Matt personally, and he is really, I think, an exemplary educator and one who I think demonstrates the best features of what we're looking for. But what makes his approach so great is the incorporation of student voice and those who are often not heard from. And so we will have the pleasure of hearing from some of his students today as they talk about their experiences in his class. And so with that, I will turn the floor over to Mr. Chaldon. Thank you so much, as well as your students, for joining us.
James, thank you so much for those kind words. All that and more back to you, sir. I'm constantly amazed by your work and what you do for students and teachers in our state. Before we get started, I want to especially thank Dr. Townsend Smith and Freebird McKinney for facilitating our participation today and lifting up students' voice. So Chairman Davis, Vice Chairman Duncan, Superintendent Johnson, board members and advisors, thank you for this opportunity to share the work and perspectives of these outstanding young people with you today. We've had the unique privilege to collaborate with educators and community partners across North Carolina to create a culturally responsive course that centers equity and civic action in our classroom. Actually, speaking with you today was one of our stated civic action goals created at the outset of a course we are now calling Art History and Civic Engagement. Before you hear from the students, I'd like to share with you some context for the creation of the course. In 2017, I was teaching African American literature, and I saw that students were more engaged with the historical facts surrounding the Middle Passage, enslavement, and the Reconstruction than the literary texts about those events. We discovered that students were simply not taught about these events, or if they were, the information was quickly glossed over, or worse, sugar-coated in order to avoid potentially uncomfortable moments in their classrooms. To To remedy this, I used more and more nonfiction and informational texts and began to get comfortable in those uncomfortable moments. This brought me to Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. As soon as I read it, I knew my students would love it, and I immediately set out to research Stevenson's work with the Equal Justice Initiative. Coincidentally, the EJI had recently announced it would soon be opening their National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which honored the victims of racial terror lynchings in America. The EJI had also created the Community Remembrance Projects that researched the circumstances and gathered soil at the sites of these lynchings. I learned that there was one confirmed case of a lynching in Wake County, Mr. George Taylor, on November 5th, 1918. When I enrolled our class in this project, the EJI informed me that 2 other Wake County schools had recently reached out to them, Exploris Middle School and Raleigh Charter High School, and so began a collaboration with those schools that continues to this day. As a part of the Community Remembrance Project, students researched 100-year-old newspaper articles and artifacts from the NC State Archives. Students gathered first-person narratives from community members, and that work led us to the site of George Taylor's lynching. The current landowner invited us to the property to do the soil collection, but they later rescinded that offer in order to distance themselves from this event. Instead of giving up, students brainstormed. They failed forward. They saw the obstacle as the way instead of being in the way, and they designed what we now call the Citizens' Promise, a combination of an anti-racist action pledge plus an individual soil donation from members of our community as a symbolic gesture that demonstrate their taking ownership of our county's history. To date, we have gathered nearly 600 Citizens' Promises from community members, businesses, civic and faith-based organizations, and schools. The culmination of this project was to deliver that soil to the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. I took 2 groups of students down to Montgomery where we visited the Civil Rights Memorial, the Freedom Rides Museum. We went to Dr. King's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. We went to the EJI's Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and that soil was finally delivered to the Equal Justice Initiative, where it now has become a part of their museum's permanent collection. Throughout this work, students enacted a truth-telling campaign modeled on Nelson Mandela's South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In doing so, students delivered presentations to our Wake County Board of Education, the Wake County Board of Commissioners, at the North Carolina Museum of History. They collaborated with Raleigh Little Theater for their production of Blood at the Root and led a post-show discussion session for the students and law enforcement officials in attendance. Their work helped inspire Mr. Lynn Council, an 86-year-old survivor of a racial terror lynching attempt by local police officers in 1952, to finally share his story. When we were at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, we looked, of course, at all of the panels from all of the counties in Carolina, which brought us to the panel that had the most entries, the panel for New Hanover County. All of its entries had the same date, November 10th, 1898. After a solemn moment, one of my students asked, "What happened?" When I answered that it was the racial massacre and coup of Wilmington, 1898, they responded with a simple question: "What's that?" That's when we knew we needed a new course. We had to delve into the history of our state and our nation, that while it might be uncomfortable to do so, it is vitally necessary. We began to design a course where we researched what we called the, quote, hard history of our state, but always paired it with a civic action project like what we had done with the EJI. And those projects would turn these students' passion and energy towards affecting positive change in our community. So with the support of our principal and WCPSS curriculum leadership, in January of 2020, we began our course. In hard history and civic engagement, we studied the lasting impact of American Indian removal in our state. We studied North Carolina's history of forced eugenic sterilization, and we did a deep dive on the racial massacre and coup of Wilmington of 1898. Of course, COVID cut our work short, and we were not able to complete the course in the way that we had planned. We had planned on touring Wilmington with the documentarians who produced Wilmington on Fire. We had planned to go to Cherokee County to visit with tribal elders and high school students. We planned to go down to Jones Street to meet with lawmakers to discuss how eugenics was legislated in our state. Even though that didn't come to pass, we continued to seek out opportunities to engage our community. And recently, Gerald Givens, the president of the Raleigh Apex NAACP, reached out to our class and asked for these students to put something together that represented their take on what is happening in our country right now. They produced an amazing video called "We Are Done Dying." That video is now being used by Mr. Givens in his town hall sessions with law enforcement officials. He uses their video so that chiefs of police around Wake County and throughout the state hear the voice of our young people and how current events impact them and where they, the students, think we need to go from here. Simply stated, I have never seen students to be more engaged than in the work that we do through this course. As we are now looking at updating social studies standards and focusing on our efforts as educators on equity, I am so excited that you get to hear directly from our students how impactful this kind of learning is. So first, I'd like to introduce Ms. Tashima Person. She is a 2018 graduate of Middle Creek High School, and she was a member of that first African American literature class to research George Taylor's lynching and to travel to Montgomery. It is with great pride and excitement that I share with you that she is currently studying at UNC Greensboro to become a high school history. Tashima.
So while thinking about the African American literature course that I had spring 2018, I realized that, I had never really had such a high level of engagement in any of my classes in Wake County. I did my senior project on what we were doing in this class. I went to the Wake County School Board, and I found literally every way I could talk about this class and my other classes. And so with graduation approaching quickly, I couldn't help but feel a little sad because the class was coming to an end, but also because it really took 13 years for me to learn about history and literature that wasn't whitewashed or sugar-coated. And so I felt like this was the first time that I was truly learning something and not just like remembering it for a test. So with all that in mind, like Mr. Chaldon said, I decided to pursue a degree in education. And so not only did this class help me decide my career path, but it also encouraged me to use my voice and speak out when I see inequality. And so I'm so thankful that I had the opportunity to take this class and have Mr. Chaldon as a teacher. Yet, I feel like more socially conscious information should be taught like in depth in core classes like history and English, and not just electives like African American literature. Because you see, before I graduated, African American Lit was offered one semester out of the entire school year, which means that few students had the opportunity to engage in coursework like this. Many students were not given the opportunity to learn this type of information, and I think that's why so many people walk around with these biases that shape their view of society, and they forget about the individuals who were left out, but also why they were left out. And so, of course, this might cause some uncomfortableness, but it's what's needed for new learning. And so I feel like it's like having the same eyeglass prescription for 13 years and then having to change it. You're going to experience a little discomfort to, get your eyes accustomed to the new prescription. And so as a future teacher and a person of color, I feel like coursework about marginalized groups and having white educators change the way that they're teaching this information like Mr. Chaldon did, like I felt like he came from a place of allyship and understanding. And it was like he came into the class like, okay, I know I'm this bald white guy teaching this class, but I'm comfortable with having this uncomfortable conversation with you guys. And also having more people of color in teaching positions, because I think it gives students the opportunity to see things through a new lens, a new perspective, helps them understand the biases and privileges that they hold, increase engagement, but also give students of color a sense of comfort within a class that they wouldn't have felt if a non-person of color was teaching it. And so to elaborate more, I just feel as though if we had more Black and brown representation, there would be more Black and brown students taking honors and AP classes. And so to be specific, according to NC report cards in the 2018-2019 school year at Middle Creek, more than 70% of students were white within an AP classroom. And so I feel like some of the students that are talking today can kind of talk about how it feels to be the only person in your race sitting in a classroom, and no one wants to feel out of place. And so I think having representation would change that.
Thank you, Tashima. That seemed like a gratuitous calling out of my bald head, but I love you just the same. Thank you. So next we have Mr. Yancey Greer. Yancey graduated from Middle Creek in 2019, and he was a member of the class to take the initial research into George Taylor's lynching and develop the Citizen's Promise. In fact, Yancey collaborated with Mr. Joe Holt, a legend in the history of integration in Raleigh, to design the logo for the Citizen's Promise. He is now studying graphic design at NC State University. Turn it over to Yancey.
How you doing, everybody? And I'm sorry I don't have a camera. What I wanted to talk about today was recently I heard that American history was going to be shortened from 2 semesters to 1 semester, and it'll be starting from 1763. And that was very impactful to me because I think that is a big leap backwards in terms of knowledge that the students need for good reflection in the future. Not only are they missing vital history, such as early American wars with the Native Americans, the influence of religion on America, and slavery and the black slave trade in America pre-colonialism. And they're missing out a lot on that because that is big knowledge. That's big knowledge, and it is big knowledge in U.S. history. And honestly, kids can't miss these this information. Kids can't miss this information because there we go. Yeah. All right. I'm sorry. Kids can't miss this information. It's vital information for people to learn and to reflect on, because in order to progress from the past, in order for kids to have good perception and good knowledge and views for the future, they have to know about everything that happened in the past. And then honestly, the curriculum for the American history isn't really good as it is. We've been fighting for a couple years to have reform into the curriculum so kids learn more of the real things that happen in America, because it is sugar-coated, it is whitewashed. And so taking out certain parts, taking out everything pre-colonialism all the way up to 1764 will only be shortening the knowledge that kids will be learning in American history. And then shortening that class to 1 semester would only be more unfortunate for the kids, considering that all their information would be numbed down and dumped down. They won't have really much time to analyze and fully process the big events in American history, which I do feel like kids deserve to be able to do, because it gives them the right mindset and it gives them the right perspectives to make decisions on their own. And kids, everybody knows that history repeats itself. So kids learn this history, they know what to do about it, and they know how it affected us in the past, and they understand what they need to do to process it and go on in the future. All right.
Thank you, Yancey.
Thank you.
Next is Miss Kayla Keaton. She was a member of African American literature and our new hard history and civic engagement course. Kayla has served as a spokesperson for our class in news interviews, on podcasts, at educator conferences, and she will soon be published in Dr. Allie Michaels' upcoming book, Teaching Beautiful Black Girls. Just as a reminder, Kayla will be eligible to run for president in 2040. Take it away, Kayla.
All right, hello, my name is Kayla Keaton. Thank you so much for having us here today. So one day in my middle school social studies class, we were discussing the civil rights movement, and a classmate said, "Black people got their rights 50 years ago. What else do they want?" I remember thinking that my teacher's response was pretty vague. However, looking back, I am now realizing that I did not know the answer either. I bring this up because in my courses with Mr. Chaldone and the 44 days since George Floyd, I've done extensive research outside of the North Carolina social studies curriculum. And this is loaded content that should have been spread over many years. I noticed the curriculum likes to focus on the Revolutionary War, the Industrial Revolution, the Civil War, both World Wars, and the Civil Rights Movement. And while classwork always gets harder, the content areas stay largely the same. Our textbooks may include some of the topics we're discussing today, but we don't read them cover to cover. And not even College Board's AP US History accurately depicts Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I just recently learned about the 1898 Wilmington Massacre, about the loophole in the 13th Amendment, which permits slavery if convicted of a crime, and the eugenics program, even the contributions of NASA scientist Katherine Johnson, among other things. And it's only natural that I question if these weren't deemed important enough, then what exactly have I learned over 12 years? I understand this may not be intentional, but it is questionable. Students of color deserve to see the accomplishments, contributions, and struggles of our communities accurately reflected in the classes we sit in every year. Right now, we're left to go behind the curriculum and do extra work. My own social media is full of students of all races seeking and sharing information regarding race relations without the guidance or supervision of teachers to unpack what we're discovering. And furthermore, when we graduate and become citizens of color, misunderstanding our own history impacts the way we will live in a world that still sees race. As Yancey said, our country is constantly repeating history because we don't learn enough to stop making the same mistakes. Students are told to treat everyone the same, but we're not taught the full extent of what happens when racist humor, comments, and ideas are taken too far, how they affect our society, and how they harm real people. There's a noticeable disconnect between students and our history because of these gaps. And in my opinion, it's the reason why social media is littered with incredibly racist and insensitive content on any given day. We can no longer afford sugar-coated and incomplete information because that directly contradicts what we see on social media now. It's almost impossible to hide what is going on every day. And we need to make sense of the world instead of regurgitating facts, names, and dates. After over 400 years, we need to recognize real American history. And based on the fact that we're having this conversation today, I think our state is the perfect place, and now is the perfect time to start changing. Thank you.
Reminder, she will be eligible for the presidency in 2040. So, finally, we have Abby Rogers. She's a member of this past graduating class of 2020. Like Kayla, Abby has bridged African American Lit and our new hard history course, and has been a fantastic spokesperson for our class in multiple mediums and settings. She is highly engaged with national and global youth activist groups, specifically in environmentalism and women's rights. She is set to attend UNC Chapel Hill. I want to turn it over to Abby.
Thanks so much for that introduction. And before I talk about the importance of incorporating more Black history into our curriculum, I want to emphasize just kind of my whiteness, and that I don't want to speak on behalf of other students, but really just to share my own experience and how I personally benefited from this type of curriculum. I think that for a really long time, I was used to being comfortable in my classroom and in my community as well. I never had the experience of having my voice spoken over or my history not shared. And at Middle Creek High School, which is a majority white school in the middle of the suburbs, I'm literally just like exemplarily average, like super basic. And I had become so oblivious of my own implicit biases and my own whiteness that I didn't ever stop to question how that had been impacting other students that were around me in my school, and how also the color of my skin was just a privilege in itself. And none of this was intentional. I've never just sat in a classroom thinking that my presence would negatively be impacting somebody else's. But when you're raised in an environment that doesn't experience racism, you don't understand how you're contributing to the problem. And growing up, I exclusively attended Wake County Public Schools. I went to Middle Creek Elementary for kindergarten and stayed in the public school system until I graduated Middle Creek High School this past June. And until my junior year, I was really reluctant to become engaged in conversations about race and white supremacy, and all of these topics that are really difficult to talk about, but are also so necessary to talk about considering the current political climate that we're in and just the current newsreel. I mean, when you're starting to talk about about the events that are happening right now in the world, such as the shootings of George Floyd and all of the other instances of police brutality recently, as a white person, it's really difficult to kind of communicate your feelings about that when you're not educated about the history of mass incarceration, Jim Crow, and slavery, and all of those topics that are covered in specifically Mr. Sheldon's class, but also could easily be incorporated into the curriculum. And I think that by taking these classes, it really specifically has prepared me to not only become a better advocate on behalf of the Black community, but also as a white person, to just kind of learn how to take a step back and learn that my privilege is very prevalent, and that my privilege makes me come from a place of basically not ever being able to understand the Black experience and what it means to be Black in America. And I think that that's really important to understand, especially now when you're conversing with your peers who are people of color and who do come from marginalized experiences. It's really important to be educated about that and kind of be mindful of really just our differences, so that we can move forward and progress in a society where everybody feels just safe and comfortable to speak about who they are and what they're doing.
Thank you, guys. So, members of the board, it is a tremendous understatement to say that I am incredibly proud of these kids. I oftentimes feel woefully inadequate as their teacher when I hear them say these things and do the things that they've done for our class. It is truly my pleasure to work with these guys. So at this point, we'd like to open it up for questions from members.
Hi, this is Mariah Morris, and I was wondering if I could make a comment.
Please do.
Proceed. Yeah.
This is not a question, but a comment. I just want to thank each student and Mr. Sheldon for having the courage and the mindset to come speak about your experiences in our public schools and share this positive experience with everyone around the state listening. As Teacher of the Year, I just want to thank you, Mr. Sheldon, for growing yourself and pushing yourself and finding curriculum that has so deeply touched and reached your students. And to the students who shared, y'all are amazing, y'all are rock stars, and you are already becoming our next generation of leaders, and we thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morris.
Mr. Ford, it's JB.
Please go ahead, Mr. Buxton.
First of all, I just want to thank everyone for the presentations, and what I would say is kind of a humbling few minutes hearing about not only your experiences in this class, but perhaps things that you don't feel like you received from the 13 years of education in the system. And so I feel humbled by that and challenged by that. The second observation is just how much, to me, you embody the adage that when you challenge students, they raise to that level of expectation. And I think this is a challenging class, challenging subject matter, challenging to you to bring not only your perspectives, but to be open to other perspectives. And it's clear that if the impact of this course has been significant, largely because of your ability to raise to that level of discourse. And it's not just impressive, it's exciting to see that play out. I'd love to direct a question, if I could, to Mr. Sheldon about the level of support he feels not just he would need for these kind of courses. Obviously, you've done an incredible job constructing a course which has had the kind of impact it's had, but when you think about your colleagues, the kinds of support you feel would be important, so we could see opportunities like this a more common occurrence in the system.
Thank you so much, Mr. Buxton. Yeah, I try to model for my students that I've had to become a learner all over again, kind of like what they mentioned, what they missed in their experiences in the classroom, I surely missed when I was a student. And I think as teachers, we tend to teach what we were taught, how we were taught it. And I had to go and learn all this stuff first myself in order to be a conduit for that for my students. And luckily, I have some amazing colleagues in my building and around my county that I could lean on, and they turned me on to great resources and great projects. So I felt tremendously supported in my county, especially one of the pictures you saw there was Tashima sharing her experience with our Board of Ed. And I cannot hype up the Wake County Public School Systems Curriculum Office enough, because we literally had not left the building before Superintendent for Instruction, Curriculum and Instruction literally ran after us and said, I want to come and talk with your kids. And they were in our classroom the next week, and it was the first time I'd ever seen this. We had district level officials in our room with a pad of paper and a pen. They didn't do any presentation. They didn't do any speaking. They sat down and they just listened. And the kids told them, A, what they wanted to know and the impact of what learning about this has had on them. So I have felt nothing but supported within my county and within my building. My principal was the first to kind of push it forward and put his support behind it. And then as we've rolled it out, that support has stayed in place at the building level and through our county. But if we were going to do this and push it out wider, which is our ultimate goal, we are going to need more PD, and we are going to need more resources available to teachers, because I will tell you, it was very difficult for me to do that self-learning. I had to go and get it. There wasn't much that was just laying out for me to come and get. I had to go and seek it out myself. So if we were to see this go wider throughout Wake County and throughout the state, we would have to be very intentional in preparing our teachers for this work.
Appreciate the answer, Mr. Ford. Thanks for letting me break in.
Mr. Ford, this is Olivia. I'd like to
Certainly,
pose
Dr. Askedan.
a comment and a question. Congratulations to the teacher and the students for the great work you're doing. It must be stimulating classrooms and stimulating discussions, and the research must be provocative. My question to you, though, is I heard you mention rather quickly doing some investigation into the place of the American Indian in our history. I would like to know how far you plan to take that in future classes. The research, the investigation, the oral histories, hoping that you will treat it a bit more than a bit.
Thank you. You're exactly right. It is oftentimes treated as just a bit, and that would certainly not be our intention. My focus moving forward with this class would be to teach specifically about the 8 tribes that we have here in North Carolina. I think people have to learn about their own backyard before they go wandering down the street and learn something else. So we want to start there, and then we want to go. That's through the taking students to Montgomery. That was the very first time that I'd ever taken students on an overnight field trip. And I was terrified at first, and now I'm addicted to it. And I see the power of getting kids out of the classroom and into a community. And that was one of the things that we had truly hoped to do this past semester, but we're not due to COVID. But I want to go and visit, go to Cherokee High School and speak with students there about their experience. I'd love to visit with tribal elders to learn directly from their experience. I do not need to stand in place and speak for somebody else. I would so much rather for my students to hear it directly from the source. But to your question, specifically in this class, I would like to look at what has been the lasting impact of removal on our state. And all the way to today, how has that impacted our indigenous communities in our state?
Thank you very much. And Mr. Ford, just a follow-up comment.
Sure.
As you prepare your lessons around those important points in history, I, as an educator myself and having taught social studies years ago, I think it's very, very important that you present the full history. It's not just the removal, but the reasons behind the removal, because there must be a full treatment to the story. The removal was very sad, desperate, agonizing, and remnants do persist today. But the students need to know that behind where we were as a nation, we were colonies at the time, and what prompted all of that. So it's giving a 360-degree treatment of those issues is what I would hope and what I would encourage you to do as you think through your focus on the Native American in American history. Thank you, Mr. Ford.
Mr. Ford?
My pleasure. And I didn't know if anyone had any, Mr. Shadow, any comment there before I proceed to the next one.
No, I duly noted, and I would also add that I always want to present a full scope also that not to focus purely on victimization and the suffering that went on, but to highlight the resistance that went on as well, that there was a good deal of that. We would definitely get into the full scope of, Jackson, a North Carolina-born president, disregarding what the Supreme Court at the time told him not to do the removal, and he went ahead and did it anyway. I mean, I would give the full scope behind that. But again, it would always lead us back to the present, and again, having the students then try to create a project that affects some kind of positive change in our community, either locally or statewide. I've learned through doing this that I can't just stand in front of the room and highlight all of this very unsettling history and then send the kids on to math class. They have to have a pathway, they have to have a channel to do something with all of the emotions that are naturally stirred up by this kind of learning. I want to give them a clear path for them to take that emotion and turn it into positive change in our community. So the ultimate end to all of that would be looking at where removal has gotten us today and what the impacts have been today and what can we do about it.
Thank you very much. Good luck.
To my vice chair, Ms. Kemmons.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. This has been so exciting to hear about the course and your experiences in it and how it has changed each of you. My question, though, I'd like to focus a little bit on your K-8 experience and ask you whether, looking back, where do you see change needing to occur in that part of your school lives?
I can take this question. So for me, a large part of my K through 8 experience, it was very focused on, how do I word this? Like I mentioned in my presentation, those 6 content areas, and it just felt like I could almost predict what I was going to learn every year because we continued to stay within those same time periods and with the same people and the same events, and the only thing that I felt would really change every year was a mnemonic device or an acronym to help me remember for the tests. And so for K through 8, I completely understand that explaining systemic racism to kindergartners doesn't work. But I think it needs to start younger so that when you get older and you go out into the world and you see social media and you're getting all this stuff, You're not trying to place it into a timeline that's already been set up for you and figure out where all of these new things are fitting for yourself. And so I think the perfect place to start doing that is probably in middle school. I think that for me, that's when I started noticing my race a whole lot more, and I know that my classmates did as well. And it's just things such as, even if you stay within those content areas, you provide the different perspectives. For example, the Civil War, I didn't really go into Reconstruction all that much until upper middle school or ninth grade. I didn't go super in detail to it until this past semester, and that's when I learned about grandfather clauses and how voting rights were denied to many Black Americans through loopholes in the legal system, and how the Jim Crow era really kicked off. I didn't fully understand that until high school, when I already started learning about the Civil War early on. So it's just providing those multiple perspectives, even if you stay in the content areas, about how certain decisions impacted different groups and how. I think that's the perfect way to fit in what we're trying to get at here.
Excellent. Do we have any further questions or queries?
Mr. Ford, this is Alan Duncan.
Yes, sir, Mr. Vice Chair.
Well, first of all, let me thank everyone for a memorable presentation. And while we have our students, I thought I would take advantage of that fact by asking this question that so relates to what they've been saying to us. What are your thoughts about how we make our history curriculum as engaging and as relevant and interesting as we can for all of our students as we move forward based on your experience?
I'll take this one. Honestly, a lot of history is hard-hitting and it's hard to hear because it makes you uncomfortable. But I feel like the most uncomfortable history, it doesn't have to necessarily be interesting because, it was bad things, but I would say it's more intriguing. Kids like to learn about the real gritty stuff that happened in U.S. history, and they like to learn it in a very interesting way. I feel like it's been too long where since middle school we've learned normal American history just regurgitated back into our faces, and it comes to where, yes, we need to incorporate more of the real America, the real things that happened, like the real events that were never taught, because it might be uncomfortable, but learning about these things and giving these students more understanding about what they're learning, and when they start building perception, they start getting more interested. And so that's what I think.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to add that, like, even in Mr. Chaldon's class, we barely use technology. We always, read things. And the fact that he basically gave us a narrative from people who were not heard and people who were forgot about, I think that that's what made the class so much more interesting.
Add one more thing.
Yes, please.
So, one thing that Mr. Sheldon did that I think he did very well was redefine what we consider as a text. So in African American literature, we looked at a music video by Childish Gambino that was released 2 years ago, This Is America. We watched a documentary about 1998 Wilmington Massacre. He brings in guest speakers, or for this class, he plans to bring in speakers every other Friday or so to speak on their perspectives directly to us, so we would have that human connection with our history. It was never, even in African American literature, it was never just let's read a book, let's read an essay, and then let's talk about it. It was, it's music, it's poetry, it's plays, it's all these different mediums that we've used throughout our history that mixes it up, but it still has that same message of this is the Black experience, or this is the Native American experience, or whatever we're looking at. And so it's looking at multiple videos, it's looking at documentaries, it's going out and doing our field trips. And so it's completely getting out of the mindset that you have to read something, you can watch something, you can speak to an expert yourself. And so I think that's the way we all really got interested in it because we saw it differently than any other class. It wasn't a textbook-based class at all.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Very helpful.
Board members, given our agenda, I want to take a moment of personal privilege to one, say thank you. You know, as like I say, as a social studies teacher by trade, I'm always envious every time I hear Mr. Chaldon and his students speak, because that is exactly how it's supposed to be done, and it does make you miss the classroom. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that you all are clearly the most important and most precious resource we have in the state. I say that unequivocally, you all are the most important people on this call. So I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insights with us. And you know, and what I take away from this is that ultimately, not just in history classes, but I would say across content, across courses, you know, there's a desire on the part of young people to learn the whole thing, right? The good, the bad, the ugly, the indifferent, that we have to make that our business. So I want to thank you for teaching us today, and thank you for your time and your work. It's been our pleasure.
Thank you all again so much. Really appreciate the opportunity. And I just put my email address in the chat. Some of the students have summer jobs, and I'm actually teaching summer school, so we're going to have to back out of the meeting at this point, but we want the conversation to continue. So please reach out, send any questions, and I'll definitely make sure the students get them. We'd love to continue this communication. Thank you all again.
Thank you so much. Pleasure's ours. Have a great rest of the summer, you all. Moving on to our second discussion, well, our first discussion item, talking about our action framework. You know, as many of you all know, the chair requested that we, you know, make our strategic plan actionable last November, following our planning and work session there. And so, you know, myself, Ms. Kamitz, as well as other strategic planning committee members, have been working diligently on doing that, on fleshing out what is an action framework that operationalizes many of the goals and objectives we identified as a part of our plan. So we decided the best course of action in order to do that was to engage some stakeholders in that process, to literally open up and to hear back from them what they would consider to be good ideas, good you know, tidbits, actual action items for our strategic plan. And so we've engaged, in addition to our committee members, individuals like you see them listed, Ms. Kayla Ramirez Moraes from our Turn NC, Ms. Christina Spears from the Office of Equity Affairs, Wake County Public School System, Mr. Jason Terrell from Profound Gentlemen in Charlotte, Ms. Lakeisha Rios from UNC Charlotte, Ms. Yasmini Robbins from Cumberland County Schools, Ms. Tanisha Shaw from Guilford County Schools, Ms. Allison Welcher from Public Impact, and Ms. Shamaya Haynes from the Westside Think Tank in Charlotte, in an effort to make sure that we're really vetting what we're doing in front of our stakeholders and getting critical and insightful feedback. And so I want to, before we kind of go into this, kind of offer the opportunity for my co-chair to offer any other insights, just to kind of set up our thought process when attempting to build out the plan of action framework. Ms. Camus, do you have anything you want to add before we dive in?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ford. You know, first I'd just like to say that since the board adopted the strategic plan, we have been working very hard to specify exactly what needs to happen and what needs to change in order to achieve these goals. The events of the last several weeks have added a sense of urgency. I think we've all been using that word as we've been together talking about what happens next. And when we met with all these stakeholders who gave us input over the last couple of weeks, their urgency was apparent to me. It was almost like many of them had just been waiting for someone to ask them what their experience had taught them was needed in terms of change in our world. And the ideas just came pouring out, and it was just a wonderful experience. And I think that we've got some really powerful ideas as part of this framework to help us really take action to move forward and affect the change we know we need.
Thank you, Ms. Kamitz. Board members, when looking at this document, you can see that it's significantly longer than the original sort of strategic plan we gave you, and that's because we thought diligently on a micro level about what specific things could be done aligned to the objectives. However, we have sort of staged these out and prioritized them. The things that you see highlighted, particularly in the green, if I'm not mistaken here, are the things that are in alignment with our Leandro, with Leandro, response to Leandro. And actually, Dr. Townsend Smith, could you, if you don't mind, could you hop in a little bit and kind of provide like a brief overview and narration of the way that we have this structured?
Yes, sir, no problem. Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well this morning. As you know, in 2019, we set out 3 specific goals that we were going to meet in our strategic plan, followed by specific objectives and sometimes components within those buckets. So following the chair's charge, we had to be intentional about what initiatives we thought would get us to where we needed to go. And while the list is many, we felt that prioritizing and aligning with what we set out in the report for the 2021 action piece in Leandro was the best course of action to pursue with this work, because trying to do everything over this course of a year is not achievable. So we're taking small bites to have the board consider which pieces we can start attacking immediately. So as Mr. Ford and Ms. Jill stated earlier, under the respective goal, you have initiatives in the TAN, and then the things that we thought that we could attack immediately and fulfill those by the end of this 2021 school year is outlined in green. Also, this group gave us feedback on items that they thought should potentially be deleted as objectives, and we noted that as well. And as a reminder for the board, we stated that our strategic plan was a living and breathing document and that we would adjust accordingly. So, for example, as we round this piece out today, let's look under goal 1, objective 2, some pieces that we know it aligns with the Leandro plan that could get us to improving school climate measures across schools and grade levels. Some of the initiatives that were outlined were providing each grade from K to 5 with a dedicated mental health professional, or require a ratio of mental health professionals to be no less than a set ratio. Those are some type examples that are outlined in this plan. So from our perspective, what we urge the board to do is to dig deep over this next month so that we can get this piece approved and get to work on some of the initiatives that are here. What you'll also notice is that some of the ideas that are outlined in here, some we have already started. It was just reinforced from the group discussion as they provided additional insights to us. Do you need anything else with that, Mr. Ford?
I do not, but I do want to take a moment to pause here and allow board members to perhaps ask any questions about what they're viewing at the present.
Mr. Ford. Matt Smith.
Mr. Bristow Smith.
Yes, sir. So I'm excited to note that in the strategic plan action framework, we have the addition of the FAFSA completion, the free application for federal student aid. as being included in the graduation data verification report that every high school in North Carolina completes. Including that as a field in the GDVR will allow us to, for the first time in as long as I have been an educator, to identify which of our students are being supported by their North Carolina public high schools in the completion of that very important document, that FAFSA form that opens up the doors to financial aid and to scholarships and to grants that make higher education possible. And even more important is that we will be able to disaggregate that data by a number of different demographics so that we can, moving forward, find ways to close the gaps between which subgroups are and are not completing the FAFSA. And so what I'm appreciative of is that in a strategic plan action framework like this, we have very big picture issues, but we also have a number of very actionable steps that we can take with very little cost to help move us forward. So I'm grateful that you guys have done such amazing work on this plan. Thank you.
Thank you for highlighting that, Mr. Bristow Smith. Are there any other comments or questions from our fellow board members?
Mr. Ford, this is Olivia again. If I could ask, I do have a question.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I know just enough about FAFSA to be dangerous. So tell me a little bit more about it and who at the school level works to make sure this process happens the right way. I know that's rewarding.
No, that's fine. And to be perfectly honest, the only thing I could be able to do is answer the first question, which is it's a form that ultimately allows students to explore the possibility of acquiring student loans, right, to be able to attend post-secondary institutions. And so in terms of the structure and who handles that at the school level, I would not be qualified to answer that particular question. But perhaps someone else who actually works in the school environment or closer to students as they navigate their process could feel free to jump in.
Dr. Oxendine, this is Matt Smith again. And
okay, thank you, Matt.
So one of the things that I'm so excited about is that with the leadership of the My Future NC folks, we now have 99 of the 100 traditional LEAs in North Carolina that have signed a data sharing agreement between the NCSEAA and their LEA so that every single high school in those 99 traditional LEAs, we have one that has not signed, but the other 99 have, will be able to have a school advocate, someone at the school that can monitor FAFSA completion and ensure that those students that are applying actually complete the process, which can sometimes be complicated and sometimes gets random triggers and audits where they require follow-up information. And prior to this year, we have not been able in North Carolina to say that every single LEA, every single high school will have an advocate who can help to make sure the kids complete that FAFSA form. So we're on the traditional LEA side, we are in very good shape there. On the charter school side, we've seen with the leadership of Dave Machado, Doug Price, and a number of other charter school headmasters and school leaders, we've seen an increasing number of charter school high schools that have also signed that data sharing agreement. So the trajectory in our state is that we are very close to having every single high school have one or more counselors, principals, or assistant principals, or a designated official like a career coach who can make sure that students who are going through that FAFSA process are able to have somebody at the school level, even if they don't have somebody at home who's able to navigate it, to make sure they complete that. And so that's really exciting for me because it's a much more broad level of support in North Carolina for our graduating seniors than we've ever had before. And I want to emphasize that data sharing agreement is full of privacy guardrails. And so at the school level, none of those advocates have income information or any kind of information that in any way compromises the natural privacy that we would want our families to have. It simply presents a dashboard that allows the school advocate to see the status of the FAFSA process, and when there is a hiccup or a hitch in the process, that they're able to step in and to smooth that out, to make sure that FAFSA gets completed. So we do know that 90% of students that complete the FAFSA actually go to college, and that kind of statistic is really important. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you, Mr. Ford.
That's a very good start. Thank you so much. At least it helps me kind of get my head wrapped around steps already taken, and that we are seeking somebody at a school level to navigate the process. And I would imagine school counselors need to be very deeply involved in those steps. Thank you, Mr. Ford and Mr. Bristow Smith.
My pleasure. So, you know, I am cognizant of the time. I wanted to make sure that we didn't have any unanswered questions or comments before we proceeded.
Mr. Ford, it's JB.
Mr. Buxton.
Just two comments for moving forward, two observations for moving forward, or maybe three to include my appreciation to you and Ms. Kamnitz and Dr. Townsend Smith for this work, which it's a big leap forward for us as a board. Given the alignment with the Leandro pillars or elements, 7 elements, I just wanted to make two observations. One is that the only element of the 7 that we don't explicitly align to here is the one regarding high quality school leaders, principals. And I think it's in some ways implicit with a number of the different objectives and action steps, but it might be worth having something explicit at some point in the document that recognizes the role principals play in achieving these objectives, probably especially as it relates to supporting teachers. So that's one. The second is, I see the comment about decreasing remediation rates, and my concern about deleting that is it's probably the best proxy for whether we are meeting the Leandro requirement in the Supreme Court opinion that we are preparing students for post-secondary access. So in fact, if we're dropping remediation rates, more students are prepared to enter credit-bearing courses in our community colleges and public and private universities. That's probably the best metric that we could show that the K-12 system is preparing people to succeed in post-secondary education, or at least one of the best and clearest that we have. So, two comments for your consideration.
Thank you for that, Mr. Buxton. And so for the record, or let the record reflect that we will circle back and add sort of something explicitly about principal leadership there. That's a incredibly valid point. And just as a clarification for Objective 5, the response there was that it ultimately didn't look like an objective, a standalone objective, but rather we would not do away with decreasing the number of students taking remedial courses, but instead just incorporate that as a metric itself. And so just wanted to make sure that, yeah, there you go. Yeah. All right, well, if there are no further questions or comments on the action framework, then I'll proceed to the next item on our agenda. And just really briefly want to context set to say, listen, you know, I'm going to editorialize by saying I don't think that there has been in recent memory a more apropos time to sort of detail our explicit commitment to achieving equity and whole child, which are the central features of our strategic plan. With that being said, we wanted to prioritize that in a way that was material. As many of you all know, we've already adopted a resolution for the whole child that works, and we wanted to work to continue in the same spirit of those resolutions by offering some explicit guidelines and expectations for how we hope to achieve equity as well. In our November planning and work session, we adopted a resolution regarding our commitment to feed our children. But we felt as a strategic planning committee that what was really missing, particularly in this moment, was an explicit declaration of our commitment to equity, which we all know is what leads to student success. You all have heard from some amazing students today, and they've given us diverse opinions and really important insights. We think it's important to capture our commitment to them in the form of a resolution, and thus what you have before you is a copy of the equity resolution that we have drafted on behalf of the State Board of Education, which details our commitment to this idea. And so if it's all right for you, and I will preface by saying it's a little bit lengthy, I'd like to read it out loud. And you all have a copy of it, our Equity in Education Resolution from the North Carolina State Board of Education, and it reads as follows. Whereas the North Carolina State Board of Education values the over 1.5 million public school children in its trust as the state's most precious resources, girded by the North Carolina Constitution, which declares that the people have a right to the privilege of education, and that it is the duty of the state to guard and maintain that right, with Article 9 specifically detailing our legal obligation to ensure equity, demanding, quote, equal opportunity shall be provided for all students, end quote. And whereas the State Board of Education is charged with providing a sound basic education for every student, which includes determining and maintaining the broad strategic priorities for the public school units, or PSUs, in our state, and whereas the North Carolina Constitution establishes the North Carolina State Board of Education as a body whose duty is to make all needed rules and regulations as it supervises and administers the free public school system, subject to laws enacted by the General Assembly, and whereas the North Carolina State Board of Education recognizes that historical and ongoing systems of inequitable and inadequate resource allocation, punitive disciplinary practices, lack of access to and supports for teachers of color, unequal access to educational opportunities and supports, implicit and explicit biases, and segregation perpetuate inequity in the outcomes of students. And whereas the board acknowledges that equity is the necessary and critical component to education that helps ensure the privilege of a sound basic education for every child. And whereas in 2019, the board adopted equity and whole child as the guiding principles for the strategic plan of our state as essential to ensuring the needs of each and every child are met, defining educational equity for our state as the belief and practice of ensuring that every student is treated in a fair and just manner, providing the necessary allocation of resources for the success of every student, and eliminating discriminatory barriers to full participation and opportunities for every student. And whereas research shows that the physical, emotional, and social health of students is inextricably linked to their academic achievement, while barriers to success for many children include systemic racism, poverty, poor health, unsafe environments, nutrition deficiencies, limited access to services and infrastructure needed to support their long-term health and safety that will ensure their access to a quality public education, resulting in rigorous academic attainment for every student. And whereas the board acknowledges that other state and local agencies, along with educators, parents, and the community are important partners, each having a significant role in meeting the needs of children by eliminating opportunity and access gaps, each sharing a common goal of supporting the health and academic achievement of every student. And whereas every student requires a safe and nurturing learning environment to be empowered to use their voice, achieve their full potential through participating in a successful academic path designed to produce graduates who pursue a lifelong interest in learning through an equitable state school system, which contributes to helping students develop the mental fortitude to become productive, empathetic citizens impacting world change. And whereas the schools are part and reflection of the local community, equity considerations focus attention on pre-K to 12 child, emphasizing the relationships between educational attainment and social and emotional learning by providing the child center of whereas recognizing that race is the determinant of equity, equity is equality of opportunity, and there's an imperative duty to construct anti-racist systems, and whereas all students thrive when equity is grounded in every aspect of the school environment, including but not limited to admittance or exposure to rigorous coursework through the advanced placement courses, funding, disaggregated and transparent data, teacher recruitment and retention, school leadership, class content, instructional time, student support, school climate, early learning, facilities, and diverse classrooms and schools. And whereas an equity framework helps to respond to social and health pandemics as well as natural disasters, necessitating that all local education agencies commit to engaging in equitable practices under the federally approved North Carolina Equity Plan and the State Board of Education Policy and Strategic Plan. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the North Carolina State Board of Education embraces equity as its framework to have the greatest impact on all students' academic success, grounded in appropriate supports for student, social, and emotional learning and well-being, and resolve that the board will review and appropriately revise its policies using an equity lens, committing to work with the superintendent of public instruction to create and maintain an equity officer to ensure consistency and continuity with the essential guiding principle inside and outside the agency, and resolve that the board will ensure culturally affirming environments in schools by urging districts to change the racist names of the schools, ensure that students see themselves reflected in the curriculum, and desegregate schools wherever possible to create intergroup contact with different racial and ethnic populations, and resolve that the North Carolina State Board of Education encourages public school units to align their strategic plans to the broad goals the board has established for North Carolina, starting with accepting and using equity as the framework to create collaborative school-community relationships to improve students' learning, to meet the constitutional mandate to provide a sound basic education by offering equitable opportunities, and resolve that the board members direct the Secretary of the State Board of Education to enter a signed copy of this resolution into the official minutes of the North Carolina State Board of Education. I would like to say I think I deserve a round of applause for making it all the way through that resolution. But we appreciate I appreciate your attentiveness, and I will pause to offer any reflections or comments before I turn it over to our chair.
James, this is Alan Duncan, and this is a very, very well done statement, and I'm very appreciative of the obvious high level of work that's gone into it. And I don't want to get into wordsmithing, but there are 2 or 3 places that sort of jumped out at me that can I share with you just for your thoughts?
Absolutely.
In the 4th whereas clause, the word punitive disciplinary practices was used. I think disciplinary practices generally are associated with some level of punishment for a rules infraction. And I think what we're really trying to get at there is disparate disciplinary practices. That is, it's undeniable that the data shows that students of color are disciplined for the exact same offense at a more severe level than students who are not of color. And so there are disparate disciplinary practices about which the equity lens needs to focus. So that's one thought. The second thought goes down to the 3rd resolved clause, which says to change the racist names of schools. And I say this from a district where we went through the process. For example, we had a Aycock Middle School, and the neighborhood surrounding it is known in our city as the Aycock neighborhood. So we went through the process of examining the name in that context, and went through a very respectful process, held a number of public meetings, and came to a place where that name was changed. And people both agreed with it and some opposed it, but all felt like the process was appropriate and fair and respectful. So that, I think that mattered. And when I say respectful to what the history is. In some instances, there can be, in an equity lens, and I'll just use a hypothetical, you could have 8 schools in a county and they're named after the 8 richest people in the county, all of whom are fine people, all of whom are white. But that wouldn't necessarily reflect an equity lens on the accomplishments of the various people in the county. Would not necessarily mean they're racist, but it might mean that the county does need self-examination from an equity standpoint in terms of the naming of the schools. So I'm wondering if we should be somewhere more along the lines of urging districts to examine the names of their schools through an equity lens, or words to that effect. And I'm not, again, not trying to wordsmith it. There may be better words. Then the last one is just sort of a technical point in that same paragraph. it says ensure that students see themselves reflected in the curriculum and desegregate schools. And I'm not sure if the ensure clause goes forward. I don't think the state board's in a position to I mean, we've had this discussion in connection with Leandro, I think, at different times. State board's not in a position to draw the lines, if you will, for schools in the different LEAs throughout the state. But I do think we're in a position to encourage and advocate for the desegregation of schools whenever possible, to create a school district that is done in a way that all students are treated in a manner that's respectful and equal in terms of their population in that district. So I offer those three thoughts, and again, I ended by commending what an exceptional piece of work it is.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. And I think a couple of these I can address very briefly, given the hour. So with regard to the notion of punitive, it would seem, if one keys in strictly on disproportionality of suspensions, that would be kind of what you might be addressing. However, I think the spirit of this resolution was also to capture a more restorative approach, so that everything that's done is not, every act of discipline is not necessarily punitive, but is done to restore the individual back to community. And so in that way, the punitive word does kind of seem more precise than necessarily suspension or disparity. With regard to the racist names, I certainly think it's a good idea to go through and make sure that there's parity in both the representation of whoever the individuals are named after. But this document, I think, was designed to urge districts to change the names of individuals who were explicitly and documented racist, which we've seen happen across the nation. And the language there is urging districts to do that. And I do think that you are correct that the school assignment, of course, is within the purview of the local education agencies, and so perhaps a different verb that precedes desegregate might be used there, one that speaks to the true power and reach of the State Board of Education and the limits. But nevertheless, even something like urging, it still kind of presents, the spirit of encouragement that we would like to see that done. But those are just a couple of ideas or comments I would offer initially to your feedback, and I thank you for offering.
Thank you for your thoughts.
Mr. Ford, this is Olivia.
Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you so much. I would feel, I want to applaud you for the time that you have given to the wording and within the spirit of this resolution. I can see a lot of hours devoted to every part of it. With that said, though, I concur with our vice chair on each point that he's made, and I would feel more inclined, more receptive to voting in favor if it's going to come to, if we're leading toward, if this is leading toward a vote by the board, if some reconsideration were given to those points, especially around the word desegregate. I understand segregation. I understand desegregation because I began my teaching career in 1970 when North Carolina was under a court order to desegregate. So I understand it, but to me it does have kind of a legalistic term. It implies that a law has been passed or is in effect that is moving us back to a segregated world, and that isn't the case right now. So I would hope that you would ask you to reconsider the verb, and I think you have already seen some reason to do so. So those are my points.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Mr. Hall?
Thank you so much. Yes, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, sir. First of all the comments made by my colleagues, I fully understand them. But my comment deals with the document itself. It is a great document. It certainly focused on the term equity, and I'm glad to see it. It is rather lengthy, I have to say that. We need to maybe to look at it, but the document itself, I totally support it as shining the spotlight on the equity issue. Just like my colleague, Ms. Oxidine, that started during the days, I started in '67. So her point is well taken. But still, I thank you and your colleagues and your committee members for putting this document together. I know it's in its draft form, but I look forward to seeing the final product real soon. I thank you, sir.
Much appreciation to you as well, Mr. Hall. And just as a point of clarification, this is just a discussion item for today. We welcome your feedback. Mr. Chair, unless there are any other comments, I believe that concludes the work of this committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ford and Ms. Kamnitz, for your leadership in this committee's work. As you stated, Mr. Ford stated, these two items, the strategic plan for action and the equity resolution, are before us for discussion and reflection over the next month, and we anticipate having this back on our agenda in our August meeting for consideration. So I welcome the feedback from my colleagues in this meeting, as well as further reflection and challenge of these two documents to make sure that we can make them the best that we can. I'm sure we'll hear from our constituents as well on these items, and we welcome their feedback. I also want to commend Mr. Ford and Ms. Kamnitz for the opportunity you gave us this morning to be reminded in listening to our students and one of our fine teachers that our differences are our strength and the benefits and power we can all enjoy by continuously learning, even in the uncomfortable moments. In fact, perhaps especially in those uncomfortable moments. We look forward to the strategic plan turning into action, and we appreciate you meeting the challenge given to you back in November. And we look forward to future steps to secure the development of a dashboard that will generate the measures and data analytics that can drive our progress towards these actions and achieving these goals. At this time, I'll now recognize Ms. White, the chair of the Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools and School Turnaround Committee. Ms. White.
Good morning, everyone. This is Amy White with the Education, Innovation, and Charter School Committee. Share the responsibility of leading this committee with Ms. Jill Kamnitz. I just want to take a point of personal privilege and say thank you so much to the colleagues on my state board who have been working diligently to further the work of the board during a pandemic, and just recognize Mr. Ford and Ms. Kamnitz for their diligence in pursuit of a document that will allow us to serve all students well across our state. This morning on the Education, Innovation, and Charter School Committee, we have several things on our agenda, the first of which is EICS 1. This is going to be a report to the board required to be reviewed by us before we present to the General Assembly on our innovative school district evaluation and update. And here to give us this report is Dr. Tripp Stallings. So without any further ado, I'll turn the agenda over to Mr. Stallings for his report.
Thank you, Ms. White. Let me know if anyone can't hear me. Chairman Davis and Vice Chairman Duncan, Superintendent Johnson, board members, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm going to make the cardinal mistake of all performers, which is to follow a better act. So my apologies ahead of time. I'd like to make a quick note before I begin, too, that because of just the vagaries of scheduling, I am coming to you today as private citizen stallings. I don't represent any institutional organization today. As those who have been on the board for a while know, I am rarely at a loss for words, and again, my apologies for that over the years, but the evaluation of the ISD initiative has caught me flat-footed on several occasions trying to figure out how to frame what we've learned over the last several years, primarily because of the uniqueness of the data that we do and don't have. As I reminded you all last year, we had last year one school with one operator and 1 year of data. As we close out the second year of implementation, we still have one school, one operator, and because of changes to the testing schedules this spring, 1 year of data. And you might rightly ask, what can we therefore say at this point about ISD as an initiative or as a policy with so little to go on? And that is what I have been reflecting on as I try to think about what to share with you today. The questions that framed the evaluation that we worked with former Superintendent Hall and others on several years ago were written with the intent of trying to evaluate what would be a multi-school initiative with multiple operators, and that hasn't happened quite yet. So we do share with you all in the report our best attempt at answering those questions. But for the most part, we try to avoid the idea of evaluating the ISD as an initiative or a policy simply based on what we learn at one school. At the end of this report, though, we do believe that after 2 years of implementation, even given the limitations in the number of entities involved, we have learned a little bit about how the policy itself works. And so I will run very quickly through our findings about the required evaluation questions, but I want to spend more of the time at the end diving into what we believe are the 5 areas in which the state board, the ISD office, the operators, and the schools themselves can work together to figure out how to improve the policy as it currently exists. And this would be in addition to some of the changes that were already made through Senate Bill 532.
Dr. Stallings.
What we learned in year 2, and as has been the case throughout the evaluation, there are 4 areas.
Dr. Stallings, this is
I have some comments here about adjusting the sound, so I'm going to stop and see if I've eliminated that problem, and if not, I'll find a different way to speak to you guys. So let me first check in and see has the echo been resolved.
Dr. Stallings, thank you for trying to work on that.
I hear from you all otherwise. Academic growth, learning conditions, school community engagement, school culture, these were the areas that we were asked to investigate as part of the evaluation. Just a general reminder, too, that because of the lack of testing this spring, we don't have anything new to share in terms of academic growth and achievement on test scores, but there were quite a few things to learn about the way the schools approached academic growth and achievement. Each of the slides that we have here provides a summary of what we reported in the first report, and then also the changes and the carryover that we note for year 2. So for academic growth and achievement, for instance, one of the things that we've focused on that we'll talk about towards the end is the importance of recognizing that because the policy allows the operators to choose curriculum, there often is the possibility of a disconnect between the curriculum and the state tested standards. We are not going to weigh in on whether or not it is more appropriate to have the curriculum policy reflect the standards of the state, or whether it's more appropriate to have the evaluation of the schools reflect the curriculum that each school uses. But I will note that that continues to be a challenge for the teachers at the first school, who all said that they love their curriculum, but that they also have to work quite a bit extra to make sure they're also covering state standards. Currently, We had good changes reported by teachers, especially in the school-wide shift in focus from efficiency to growth, which made a big difference for the teachers and for us all. It was a universally embraced notion at the school this year to think more in terms of growth, and they felt like they had a better opportunity to share with students discussions about their progress, rather than just saying to them you didn't meet proficiency, but more about you were showing growth in these areas, and the evidence of data-driven instruction was much more prevalent. I'll pause for a minute there because there are a couple of things that we noted about measuring academic growth at these schools that we think are important for adjusting and rethinking the policy itself.
Stallings.
The first is something that was brought up to our attention by the instructors there themselves. We think it's worth mentioning. They note, and it may come as a little surprise, that they believe there's quite a difference in the academic trajectory of what they refer to sometimes as their legacy students, the students who had experience at their school before they converted to ISD, and then the students who came new or transferred into the school. We'll talk about the ramifications of that at the end briefly. Also note, and this is probably likely going to be the case in other schools. Oh, I had a note here that someone's asking a question. Sorry, Ms. Pike.
Dr. Stallings, this is Amy White. We are having some audio issues on our end, and this is an important report. And so what I might ask you to do with the board chair's permission, of course, is to perhaps ask you to disconnect and then reconnect. There's vibration, and we just truly can't understand what you're trying to share with us. Do you mind trying to do that? And then perhaps, Chair Davis, if we could move to EICS2 quickly and then have Dr. Stallings rejoin and sort of summarize where we were and then begin again.
Yeah, my apologies for that. I'll hang up and then I will call in instead. How's that?
I think that sounds great. Thank you so much. Let's board members, let's go to EICS2 really quickly. Let's see, I'm hoping that that Mr. Machado is ready to go with me on this. Mr. Machado, and I believe Alex Quigley is also on the call today.
Yes, ma'am, Ms. White. Both Alex and I are on the call, and Mr. Quigley will lead this discussion, and I believe he is on the line.
Okay, good morning to each of you. Welcome, Mr. Quigley. I understand you have some schools who are have met the criteria for the Charter School Advisory Board for ready to open. Would you share that information with us today? Mr. Quigley, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, we're ready, sir.
Yes, sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I'm looking at the right. So good morning, board members. Thank you for providing some time for us to share our recommendations for Ready to Open. This obviously is the context in which these charter schools are opening is unique, and as in a situation where the opening of school is still uncertain for all students in the state. And given that, we've been particularly diligent in evaluating their data, and evaluating their all the components of the Ready to Open checklist that they're required to submit. We also applied some additional pressure to schools that were not came to us at the most recent meeting a month ago and not at the thresholds that they needed to be, and we're able to see those schools respond well to that and meet the thresholds that made us feel more comfortable, primarily from an enrollment standpoint than we were. And we actually had a few schools that we had a meeting with yesterday just to get another update, so that we're making sure that we're bringing these recommendations to you with the most up-to-date information. And as you'll see on the document that we've unanimously recommended a number of schools, so a total of 8, I believe. We did not recommend Kaleidoscope Charter High School for ready to open status, and I'm happy to answer any questions that board members have.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley. Board members, what questions do you have about the schools that have been presented today to you from the Charter School Advisory Board as recommended? 8 of the 9 have been recommended for ready to open status. Kaleidoscope Charter was not recommended. Colleagues?
This is Alan Duncan. Could I ask a couple of questions?
Absolutely. Vice Chair Duncan, please.
Yeah, Mr. Quigley, you said that the projection on enrollment, I just want to stick with the Elaine Riddick Charter School first, that there have been some questions about that, which I understand, having looked at the materials. At the time, there were only projected enrollment of 38% with 45 students as of just June 1st, so we're about a month later. What are the changes that your board has uncovered in the further interviews you've had?
Yeah, they had a pretty marked turnaround in their enrollment numbers, so I believe they're above the 75% minimum threshold that we're comfortable with, largely because they were able to finally get out and knock on doors and kind of do the door-to-door recruiting that's particularly impactful in a rural community. And so in that enabled them to really kind of plan their numbers. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but Dave probably does. But they definitely were in.
Yes, this is Dave Machado, Ms. Quigley. I think they were at 83% as of yesterday's CSAP special call meeting. 83% of their enrollment.
So I understand the process. Is that people who have actually enrolled, or is that people who are expressing a strong interest or some other form of indication? How is that indicated here?
That is enrollments, and we asked the same question, and it's not, this is no longer interest forms or just completing a survey. These are enrollments, and the Office of Charter Schools actually requested and received the data, so parent names, student names, enrollment information to verify those enrollments. Obviously, we did not post that due to privacy concerns, but there was an extra step taken this year to verify the data.
And then the other question I had on this school was the staff hiring, and it says as of June 1st, it indicates the number of positions that were being looked at for hiring, which included the school leader position, as well as 6 core content teachers and some other important positions within the school. What is the status on that?
Yeah, there was a request made that they have the school leader hired and attending the meeting yesterday, and that was met. I will say I don't recall specific information about teacher hiring, but Dave may have.
Yes, they hired their executive director and 5 staff teachers have been hired.
So
And their EC coordinator director has been hired also.
Okay. So they're not quite, they're much closer than they were on June 1st. Is that what I'm hearing, Dave? Mr. Machado?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, they are.
All right. Then, I'd also, Ms. White, if you would permit me, about School of the Arts as well.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
And they're they're not dissimilar. The enrollment projection there again was 35% as of June 1st, and you indicated some inquiry had been made. What did the committee find out upon inquiry on that, the enrollment situation?
They actually, I believe, were over 100% of their target at this point.
Okay, so that's changed pretty dramatically in the last month, it sounds like.
Yeah, they've been very active in the community, and we saw some trend lines even in the meeting, just some data in the meeting in June, which again made us comfortable, given the unique circumstances this year, to give them a few more weeks to work through, and we're satisfied with what we saw yesterday.
Okay, the other question I have is also staff related for that school. And according to the June 1st report, it did not have evidence that there was a school leader, and at least 75% of the staff members had been identified for hire at that point. I couldn't tell if that 75% had been hired or had not been hired as of then, but what's the hiring status as of now in terms of school leader and staff members for the school?
I know they have a school leader, Dave. You might know more on the teacher side.
Yes, they have hired their leader. Actually, she's been on board for a year or close to a year, because they were part of the NC Access grant, and they were able to hire their teacher and pay for through that the NC Access grant. And from my understanding, they've hired, I don't know the exact percentage. I think it is somewhere around 70% of their staff has been hired. And they're finalizing the rest of them right now.
All right, so at this point, Dave, or Mr. Machado, I apologize, over 75% of the staff has been hired now. Did I hear that right?
Yes, sir.
All right. So, Ms. White, thank you for your patience. That information was important to me. I'm still concerned about these schools. This is a lot of activity taking place here, and we're now only a month and a half away from the start of school and what promises to be an extraordinarily difficult year. I have concerns for all the schools that are trying to start in this environment. It's going to be challenging for well-established schools, but had particular concerns about a lot of work having to come together in a very short period of time in an extraordinarily challenging environment. So, thank you for letting me make those inquiries to get further information.
Thank you, Vice Chair Duncan. While we're talking about an extraordinarily difficult time to be reopening schools already in existence, Mr. Machado, can you just talk us through what these 8 who have been recommended have done as far as submitting remote learning plans, opening with respect to the COVID guidelines? They've been engaged in any conversations, and has OCS had an opportunity to review the work that they're doing in order for them to be compliant, and similar to the compliance for schools all across our state?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that question. All of our RTO schools have been participating in our weekly calls that we've had with Dr. Stegall and Dr. Emery. We've been in constant communication with them, making sure they understand what their requirements are, what the DHHS guidelines are. We send out daily blasts to every one of our schools for any information that's coming from the Department of Public Instruction. They're on that list. They're on our newsletter list. So we have theoretically treated them like they were already open, so they received every communication. We had a one-day virtual training for all of our ready-to-open schools, and that was mentioned at that time. They totally understand their obligations. They have had to submit their Jumpstart plan, as every other school has had to do, and they're preparing to submit their remote instruction plan also. And we've been in communication helping them understand what that plan would look like. So they have had access to all the communication and training that our office has provided, as has the schools that are already open.
Thank you, Mr. Machado, for that work. Board members, do I have any other questions about any of the other schools recommended for approval at this time?
Ms. White, Olivia here.
Yes, Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you, Ms. White. And you really touched on the question that's been lingering in my brain for a few days about all schools, but specifically our new charters and in this world of COVID. Mr. Machado, just another question to you about that point is what seems to be, if the charters have any concerns about opening in a COVID world, what seems to be their any apprehension they might have, or do you sense any apprehensions from facilities, from safety, from the guidelines that we're under?
I think our charter leaders are feeling the same apprehensive as the district schools are. I think that we have really tried to stress to our school leaders to utilize their calendar flexibility, to utilize the flexibility that charter schools have as far as, are you going to come back in a blended model? Are you going to come back remotely? Are you going to come back the different scenarios that charter schools should be able to have with the flexibility. And I think the calendar flexibility is one of the biggest things that our schools are trying to take advantage of. But our leaders, our teachers, and our parents are concerned about having their students go back into a classroom in the buildings, obviously, without a vaccine, or how are they going to treat a student that doesn't wear a mask versus the ones that does wear a mask. So I think it's pretty universal that we're experiencing the same apprehensions that traditional school leaders are having. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that's what I'm hearing from my leaders.
All right, yes, that does. Thank you very much, and thank you, Ms. White.
Thank you, Dr. Oxendine. Any further questions? Okay, thank you for that discussion. So the recommendation from our committee will be to uphold the recommendations as presented by CSAB for the 8 of the 9 schools recommended for ready to open status for this coming school year. So let's go back to EICS 1 and give Dr. Stallings another run at presenting the work that he's done. Dr. Stallings, are you there?
I am. Let's do an audio check. How's that sound?
That is so much better. Thank you so much for being flexible and allowing us to have an opportunity to receive the information that you have to present. I'll turn it back.
I appreciate your patience, and I'll try to be even more brief in light of the fact that I cost you a little bit of time earlier. Just a quick note, I don't know how much of what I said earlier you were able to hear, but I want to note that because of the vagaries of scheduling, I'm coming to you today as private citizen Stallings. I'm not speaking on behalf of or as a representative of any institute or organization. What I led with before the audio became problematic is just how challenging it has been for us to think through how to conduct this evaluation, largely because of what we shared with you last year, and we'll share again, that we had one school, one operator, 1 year of data, and that's not really enough to evaluate the impact of a policy. This year is not a whole lot different. We have still one school, one operator, and because of the cancellation of state tests, we still only have 1 year of academic data. That doesn't prevent us from answering the evaluation questions that were put to us, but I think that they are of limited value relative to the larger observations that we've tried to make about what to do about trying to improve the policy as you enter into a phase in a couple of years of adding more schools and more operators. So I will briefly run through the outcomes relative to the required evaluation questions, but then we'll, at the end, focus a little bit more on our formative recommendations that we think the board, the ISD operator, and others ought to consider moving forward. I'll stop there to make sure the audio is still okay.
I can hear you terrific. Colleagues, are we good?
Okay. So just moving very quickly, like I said, through the required evaluation questions, I'll start with academic growth and achievement. Just a reminder too that we of course have no state testing this spring, so we don't have any second year out data. Even if we did, we wouldn't call it trend data. We would want to see 3 or 4 more years before we said anything in terms of trends. Each of the segments is presented with a reminder of what we said in 2018-19 after the first year, and then a couple of notes about things that changed for 19-20. The academic growth side, there were some important changes outside Ashpole, the most important being a shift from a focus on proficiency to a shift to growth. That may seem like a minor point to note, but I think it's pretty important for helping future ISD schools frame how to think about what success looks like and how they communicate it. That change from talking about proficiency to talking about growth gave the teachers ways to share with students their successes, even if they weren't hitting the proficiency marks everyone wanted. An important thing to keep in mind here, and I'll bring it up later, but I want to just touch on it briefly. Because legislation allows for the operators to choose their curriculum, it does not necessarily mean that the curriculum will align with state standards, but the state standards are what the schools are tested and evaluated on. And we'll talk at the end about the ramifications of that. Before I leave academic growth and achievement, just a couple of notes going forward as you continue to evaluate the impact of the ISD initiative. The first is one that was brought up by most of the educators at Southside Asheville, and I think they make a good point, that while they understand they should be evaluated on the progress of all students at their schools, and while we as evaluators believe that should be the case too, there's also some value likely in disaggregating those results for students who were new to the ISD school and students who had many years under their belts at the ISD school before the conversion. We don't think that that the state should remove requirements by any stretch of the imagination for the schools to be evaluated across the board, but there could be some value in looking ahead of time and looking a little more carefully at differences in the trajectories of these different categories of students to start to pick up ahead of time some positive growth before it might become more evident at the school level. Another thing of note is that, and again, we've only been there for 2 years, but there has been a notable, though not substantial, change in student population each year. That's probably going to happen at other ISD schools too as they settle in. It makes it a little harder yet again to talk about successes or changes over years as student populations are not the same year to year. It's not dramatic, but it's probably between 15 and 20% of the students are different this year from last year, and it's also a smaller school this year. We'll talk a little bit later on about the impact of what happens when multiple schools have multiple curricula with the same state testing in place. Moving on to learning conditions and student behavior. It was, by all accounts, a much better year at Southside Ashpole, and it was most notable in the way the students felt about being at their school. Discipline was much less of an issue. The students in the surveys reported that they enjoyed going to school more. Parents not only said that they understood that attending school regularly was absolutely essential, but across the year, as we surveyed them across months, they continued to grow in that assessment, which is also a good sign of change. School community engagement also experienced a number of upticks. Teachers believed that parents felt more comfortable talking to administrators and teachers. Parents felt that way as well. There was a more welcoming atmosphere. A lot of the credit was given to new school leadership. Parent volunteerism increased. It hadn't quite reached the level that they wanted yet, but it was getting there. In terms of school culture and staffing, one of the things that the teachers noted, and this is important again, not just because it happened at Southside Ashpole, but because it's likely to be something that comes up at other ISD schools as we watch operators implement their approaches to turning around these schools. All of the teachers noted that they had a significant time commitment as a result of being at that school. Not that they were surprised, but the time commitment was increased not only because the operator's approach was to extend the school day, but also because the population is a challenging population to educate. That's why it's part of the ISD. And because one of the strategies that the school used for encouraging teacher leadership involved significant time in committees. We bring this up not as a critique or criticism, but just to note that the commitments of time that may be necessary to achieve success in these schools are also likely going to impact retention of teachers in a negative way, and there's probably a way to be proactive about that going forward. So that's just a note to keep in mind. Administrators believe that the staff were more cohesive in year 2, and that's not surprising given that there was new leadership and also a chance for the school to settle in. And teachers noted that their evaluations were more frequent. In terms of leadership, like I noted, though opportunities existed in both years for teacher leadership, they were much more real for teachers in year 2, and teachers and staff were genuinely leading a lot of committees and all felt in all of our conversations with them a strong sense of being a part of the leadership of the school. But again, it required a significant investment of time. One more on school culture, and then I'll wrap up the required evaluation questions. And this was just overall, you get the sense anytime you went into the school this past school year that things were much more positive. The teachers called it a more family-oriented environment. The students reported directly that they enjoyed going to school more and perhaps more importantly, believe that they were treated fairly and with respect at higher rates than they had in years past in the previous year. And the parents also noted their children were safer. They believe their children were safer in school. I'll pause there for a second, and I'm sorry to have run through those so quickly, but really those were the obligatory evaluation questions that we had to ask. And again, I want to note that because it was one school with one operator, we don't want to overemphasize the value of these findings. They're really, we hope, just more formative for the individual school, but also to help the ISD office think about the things that are going to be important for other schools. More important, I think, will be the formative recommendations we make for ISD going forward. So I'll pause there a second to see if there are any questions about that.
Ms. White, this is Olivia.
Go ahead, Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Stallings, for this update about the school, Southside Ash Bowl. I'm drawing a quick conclusion that things must be much better in terms of culture, leadership, and professional the academic piece compared to years past. My one question is, if you would, I'm a little bit confused about one of the frames on maybe a couple frames back on the achievement. Something about, I can't remember it. I just need more clarity about the 2018-19 challenges. Yes, that's the one, yeah.
Okay.
If you could just take a minute and talk about it, only a minute, because I don't want to prolong.
Sure. Was there anything in particular there, or do you just want me to cover it again?
Yes, the carryover 1920 and 2019-20.
Yes, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about that in the end, but the policy, as you know, allows for the operators to choose their own curriculum. But the evaluation is, or the quantitative evaluation is based on the degree to which the students meet state standards, which are tested using the state test. We run into this challenge also in our attempts to try to evaluate the academic impact of, for instance, the Opportunity Scholarship voucher program. When there's a disconnect between the curriculum that is used and the state standards on which those schools are tested, you don't get a true measure for what kind of growth happened in the school. To accommodate that at Southside Asheville, the teachers reported to us that they loved the curriculum they had, they loved teaching it, but they also had to do a little bit of double time work to also cover some of the state standards that their curriculum doesn't cover. That's the challenge, and we offer a number of possible solutions down the line for that. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely. That brings a lot more clarity to it. Perhaps I wasn't listening well the first time.
No, I'm doing double time. I'm rushing, so I'm sure it's on me. Sorry about that.
That makes plenty sense to me. I can understand where the teachers are coming from.
Yep.
Thank you.
So, Ms. Townsend-Smith, we could skip back down to slide 12. I'll wrap up here. Yes, that one. I want to make clear that when we conduct the evaluation, we are chartered by the board to do this evaluation, and so you all are our client, and we share back with you things that the board can address. We don't necessarily want to say, by framing it that way, that other people shouldn't be involved too. And these 5 formative recommendations that we're going to share probably are going to be best addressed, if the board sees fit to do so, by involving all of the different parties who are in play for these ISD schools, and that's the community of operators. You know, right now there's only one, but we would assume there'll be more going forward. The ISD office at the DPI, the board, to think through what collectively all of these actors can do to improve the possibility of the ISD having the impact that the legislation hopes that it will. The first two are more sit down around the table and talk through what we're going to do actions. And that first one is what we were just talking about. To think about ways to address the disconnect between the curriculum freedom, which is an important part of the policy, and at the same time, the requirement to evaluate the schools based on the state standards. And I don't think you choose one or the other. I think that there's just some thought to some value to thinking through how to make both of those things viable. And Southside Asheville can probably provide a lot of good data for folks to consider as we think about solutions to that challenge. For instance, do we require ISD schools to adhere to curricula directly support state standards? Well, that's going to be contrary to the current legislation. However, there may be some value in requiring operators to demonstrate how their chosen curriculum concords with state standards, or what they are doing to fill that gap. The second is to consider whether evaluating academic growth should be done using something that measures directly the impact of the curriculum chosen. And again, we're not going to weigh in on whether or not these or other options are the right ones. We just note that this is going to be a challenge going forward, especially as more schools are added that are using different curricula, and that might, when compared to each other via the state test, look very different from each other. So that's just a note for going forward. The second is what I mentioned earlier, the idea of, in addition to doing whole school and whole grade evaluations, there's probably also some value in disaggregating results for those students who are new to the ISD school versus those students who had 3, 4, or 5 years of experience ahead of time before the conversion. I think that the teachers are correct that that it takes a couple of years to create a culture at a school that everyone is a part of, and that it might be valuable to measure the successes of the newer students in addition to the successes of the whole school to see if there's some earlier trends that can be detected. Those are two short ones just to consider. I'll stop there for a second before I move into the last three, which are a little broader, to see if there are any questions about those two.
Questions?
All right.
Ms. White, it's JB.
Yes, sir, Mr. Buxton.
Just on the curricular piece, I think this may be one of the more important considerations moving forward with the ISD and turnaround in general, which is about the quality of the curriculum that's chosen, clearly the alignment. I'm a little surprised that there's commentary that core knowledge and Eureka Math are not aligned to our state standards. I'm no expert in that, but that's surprising given what I know about those curricula. But I think the fidelity of implementation of a high-quality curriculum that's aligned to standards is critical. So given so that we avoid what a lot of research has shown, which is that curricular choices often lead to assignments and classwork that is below grade level standards, and so kids remain in a perpetual remediation loop and they never accelerate. And so if the curriculum is not, in fact, accelerating our kids at Southside Asheville or anywhere else the ISD is, we're behind the 8 ball and we never catch up. So I appreciate Tripp and the Friday Institute raising this issue, and I think it's something we're going to have to get really clear on what we expect. For my money, it would be clear curriculum outlined to standards, clear fidelity of that curriculum, and evidence of implementation of that curriculum, not teachers picking and choosing stuff they think might be good. These kids are too far behind for that kind of time. We don't have that time. So I have as you might tell, strong views on this, but I think moving forward, we got to get clear what our point of view is as a board.
I need to make sure that I'm clear too, that we as an evaluation team, we're not tasked with evaluating the curriculum chosen, so we didn't do a deep dive on concording the two. I know that the core knowledge and Eureka Math do share a lot of commonalities with the state standards. We're merely reflecting back what the teachers said to us, which was that their belief that the good curriculum they had, that they enjoyed implementing, had a few places where they felt like they had to do some additional work to make sure that the standards were met. So they were trying to make sure that they were covering everything on the waterfront there. But again, I'll caution that our evaluation didn't do a deep dive on that. So to Mr. Buxton's point, we wouldn't want to try to conclude that the curricula chosen were inadequate, just reflecting what the educators there told us.
This is Mrs. White. If I'm remembering from academic performance data presented last year, some of the gaps that were revealed had to do with fifth grade science and just not necessarily a lack of alignment, but more so a gap in that particular curriculum area.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. And I agree, Mr. Buxton. It is a critical question and will significantly impact if we're given or following state statute that we identify other schools and find ourselves in a position where we're choosing future operators. That question should be at the forefront of our discussion. Other questions before we turn it back to Mr. Stallings Dr. Stallings to proceed? Okay. Dr. Stallings, just do the last. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. White. The last three are the result of our 3 years of reflection about the ISD. And I say 3 years because we also worked with former Superintendent Hall in the planning year to think through what ISD might be, in addition to our 2 years of being down at Southside Asheville as often as we could be there. And so, as I noted at the beginning, we offer these as things for everyone involved in ISD to think about and reflect on and think about how to address if the board decides it's important to do so, not to say this is the operator's responsibility or the ISD office's responsibility of state boards. I think everybody needs to be at the table on these if they are determined to be meaningful. The first is, right now in the legislation, the enacting legislation, there's very little in the way of a supporting underlying robust theory of change. What do we think having an ISD does that a restart school doesn't do, or that a charter conversion doesn't do, or any of the other, or a discount school transformation, any of the other things that we have put in place in this state over the years to try to assist struggling schools. And the importance of having something more robust in terms of that theory of change and a common language to talk about it is because it will give the state, the operators, and everyone else involved a place to start in their conversations about what it is that we need to do at this particular school or that particular school. Every challenge will be different at every ISD school. But the overall belief of the mechanisms that ISD puts in place probably should be shared. You might note in the full evaluation that we have a preliminary logic model at the end that we developed with former Superintendent Hall several years ago, but that was created before an ISD school opened, and it needs to be revisited now with 2 years of information under our belt to think about what it is that we think ISD can bring to the table as a policy, as a concept that we can't get from other forms of turnaround attempts. I note just separately that another really key of that is providing the operators and the ISD office with the time necessary before an ISD school opens to work through a lot of these issues. And just due to the timelines that were present for the first school, that didn't really happen. But before a second school opens, I think it's pretty important for the board to consider how to provide the time and planning necessary before the first children enter the school door. Got 2 more, and then I'll open it to any other questions you all might have. And I appreciate your indulgence as we got reconnected here through phone. The second one, the fourth one here is something that we have almost no experience with in the state. And we knew it on paper before it started, but we didn't know what the ramifications would be until we played it out. With the partial exception of the NC Virtual Public School, we have almost no modern experience with managing or maintaining or running a geographically disparate and remote district. And in the case of Southside Asheville, it's just one school, but when you have 2, 3, or 4 schools across the state that are likely not going to be near each other, this challenge is going to become more dramatic, and we already started to see some of it in the first couple of years. And it has a lot to do with maintaining the relationships that are necessary between the operators, the state board, the ISD office, and others, a lot of which, in this time of the coronavirus, we're much more aware of this. The challenges are exacerbated when we don't have face-to-face contact. So I've started to talk through some possibilities with folks about this, but I think we've learned enough over the first 2 years to really sit down and consider what do we need to do to successfully manage what's going to be a quite geographically diverse district once 2, 3, or 4 schools are on board. One of the ideas, for instance, we talked about was whether or not it was important to have embedded in the regions representatives from the state, not to serve as oversight, but to serve as liaisons for communication, things like that. We didn't get into details about what might be solutions. We just know it's a challenge. The fifth and final one is one that I think you all are quite aware of, and that was a significant issue during year one. We note it here simply because after year one, we had a change in leadership at the state level, we had a change in leadership at the operator level, we had a change in leadership at the school level, but the same tensions existed across the entity. And that, to me, indicates that it's not about individual people, it's more about the structure itself. In some ways, number 5 is really an extension of number 3 and 4, where we don't necessarily have an underlying robust theory of change or a strategic plan for how to manage a district remotely. But I think you all are pretty aware as a board of the challenges that the ISD has faced in terms of maintaining the types of relationships that are necessary for success for schools going forward. And so we just bring it up again to note that after 2 years, and with changing in faces, that it's likely more to do with the way that the policy is structured than anything else at this point. So I'll pause there for a second to see if anyone has any other thoughts or questions.
Questions for Dr. Stallings about the information that he presented in this second segment?
Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share the results of the report, and I'll remain available for any follow-up that anyone has. Just let me know.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stallings, for joining us today for this presentation. So board members, this, as you know, is a presentation that we shared with the General Assembly as required by statute. I'll let you know that Ms. Kamnitz and I are having the discussion about this particular school and embedding it in broader conversations with regard to school turnaround in general, our responsibilities as we meet the expectations of Leandro, the conversations about students that are in low-performing schools and providing them with the supports that are offered through our regional systems of support, and how is this school different than statutorily than what we would be doing for the other almost 500 low-performing schools in the state. So it is a much broader context, but the takeaway is that we have some work to do, and as Dr. Stallings shared, there are some structural things that some might call them limitations, others might call them opportunities, but we've got some things to work on, particularly if we are going to be required by state statute to add additional schools in the future. Ms. Kamnitz and I hope I'm not putting words in her mouth, are thankful that we have been given this year of reprieve to evaluate what occurred at Southside Ashpole this year, to look forward and refine, redirect, collaborate on how we can further the work that's being done, the positive work that's being done on behalf of those students. Ms. Kamnitz, do you have any comments before we move to our other item?
I was just about to send you a message that I'm shaking my head as I'm listening to you. Absolutely.
Love it.
Miss White.
I'm nodding my head. Excuse me.
Yes. Yes, Dr. Oxendine.
Yes, I'm going to be extremely brief. in my comment, and it's really to say I am, as this presentation ends, I am feeling very hopeful and very optimistic about good things to come at Southside Asheville, which is, I could get in my car now and be there in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Oxendine. Other comments from board members? Okay, well, that'll close out EICS 1 again. Dr. Stallings, thank you for your time today, for the tremendous amount of work and the time that you spent in the school, just watching and learning, and now reporting to us what you've seen and observed.
Well, thanks to the board for allowing us the flexibility over the years to try to reshape the evaluation in a way that we hope will be helpful going forward, given that we didn't have necessarily the conditions on the ground to evaluate as we originally intended to do. I hope that we can continue to add a voice as needed going forward. Thanks for the opportunity today.
Thank you so much. Okay, board members, the next item on our agenda is, we covered EICS 2, of course. EICS 3 is Three River Academy's request to relocate, and they are also requesting that we remove the growth stipulation that we had placed on them. And so here to talk through that with us is Mr. Dave Machado.
Thank you, Ms. White. As we discussed at our last meeting, Three Rivers is in Bertie County. They're in their second year of operation. As you remember, they assumed a school that had closed. They were requesting to move back to their original location in Windsor from Powellsville. It's more than 5 miles. I think it's close to 20. So State Board of Ed must approve this move. The reason that they want to move, it's more centrally located, and they have a much more favorable lease on the building. They did come before CSAB yesterday to discuss these plans, discuss their ability to get an educational certificate of occupancy, and to discuss their enrollment. And yesterday, our office did reach out to Bertie County Department of Inspection to find out how close this school is to get their educational certificate of occupancy. And with our discussions with them, we feel like this is attainable within probably the next 2 to 3 weeks. So we feel comfortable that they will be able to use that building.
Thank you, Mr. Machado. Do you have an update for us on student enrollment numbers?
They told us that it was over the 80 level student mark that's statutory required. CSAB did require them to provide us the same information that the other RTO schools had provided. This was not an RTO school, but we wanted to see the actual names of the enrollment, and they have to provide us that list for the CSAB's regular scheduled meeting next Monday.
Okay, thank you for that. As I'm looking and board members, I'll draw your attention to the executive summary. You'll remember last month we had a discussion about a stipulation that we had put in place to require growth at the end of their second year, and we had some discussion about that, and perhaps a maybe different opinion than the Charter School Advisory Board. I'm inclined to keep the growth stipulation in place, but I want to ask Mr. Machado, in absence of data from this year and the uncertainty of validity of quantitative data, not qualitative data, being available, can you shed any light on CSAB's discussion to remove that stipulation?
The reason that they wanted to remove it was because that stipulation was in it. They had to have it for this year, and the fact that there was no data, they felt like that stipulation needed to be removed. In turn, the discussions that we've had either at the leadership level or at the meeting itself, I think they totally understand that the need to keep a growth stipulation in for the coming years. They are concerned to keep it in for next year. We're not quite sure what the testing situation is going to be for next year either, but because it was a stipulation and there's no data for this year that we just finished, they felt like that, that stipulation wasn't, I don't want to use the word relevant, but it wasn't needed at the time, or so that's why they were suggesting that it be taken off.
Okay, board members, do you have any questions or comments about Three Rivers and its move from one location to the other, and anything that we've or you've heard presented today?
Ms. White, JB.
Yes, sir.
Just wondering, do we have any NC check-in data or K3 diagnostic data that could give us some proxy?
They have not provided that information to us, and we did not request it, Mr. Buxton.
Okay, Ms. White, I would just make the comment that I don't have an issue with the move. I trust that they're looking at the best place for the student population they're looking to recruit. It would be nice to know that we are supporting a school that's moving in the right direction. And I'm not suggesting that it's not, I just don't have any data.
Mr. Buxton, that therein lies the quandary. I agree. So we, as a board, I feel like we, because of the history of Three Rivers, that we must continue to hold feet to the fire and give the board's expectation that academic performance and growth continue to move. So I would say that we would approve, the recommendation will be that we will approve the relocation, of course, contingent upon that receipt of the certificate of occupancy, and that Three Rivers must present check-in data to the CSAB at the time that they have that receipt, and that information be passed to the Board of Education for review.
Just
no. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I do, Ms. White. I do have a question. So for clarity, the growth. Are you planning to remove the growth requirement or leave it in there?
Well, the language suggests, and perhaps Mr. Machado might help us tweak. We have an absence of data, and there's an uncertainty about whether or not we would have approved that, given that we're in a vacuum here and they need to know, given the fact that they're opening school here in about 6 weeks. So I would say that the board has at its discretion the opportunity to review academic performance at any time and some stipulation. So what I'm suggesting is that we would approve the relocation request, but that the stipulation would be that the school must communicate with CSAB as soon as NC check-in data is available for the coming year. We just don't have any data to make a choice on at this particular time. Mr. Machado, you have any guidance on that?
I think that's a very good stipulation or suggestion. And you're talking about you would like to see the NC check-in data for the upcoming academic year, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and we can also request what their data was for this past year, if they did participate in the check-in, and what their K3 literacy data was. We can get that for you hopefully by your next meeting. But we totally support what keeping that growth stipulation in, just moving it down another year.
Yes, sir.
One last quick question. Oh, sorry.
No, just that clarified where we were heading. Thank you.
Did I hear another question?
Yes, this is Alan. One last quick question. What is the enrollment now that was provided by the school?
They said it was slightly over 80. They didn't give us any documentation to prove that, but they said they were over the 80 mark.
Is any approval of this going to be contingent upon you receiving documentation to affirm that fact?
That was discussed at the CSAB level, and they were made very aware of the fact that they did not meet that 80 threshold, that the possible of a revocation could be in play. CSAB made that very clear at their Monday meeting. Yesterday's meeting.
Yeah, my only question is that something we should also make clear by having it be a stipulation. They've got to have 80 or more.
Well, that's in, Mr. Machado, that's in policy.
It is, Ms. White, but there has been some schools that were able to stay open because of their finances allowed them to do that. So that would be a reasonable stipulation also.
Okay, board members, would you like to have that added? Or do you feel comfortable with the information that was shared with them through the Charter School Advisory Board that they had to make 80? No, requirement. You would like to see that in language?
All right, my recollection is that they actually went below 80 last year at some point. They may have started the year at 80 or just barely above and went below. So I would like to have that language in there. Just one board member.
Any thoughts in addition to Mr. Duncan's request?
Ms. White, if I can add to that, I think it's important that the stipulations say that they have 80 students at the end of their 20-day ADM count. If they go mid-year and drop down to 75, I don't think, in my opinion, it's practical to send those students back to Berkeley County. So I think if that stipulation is put in place, that it should stipulate that that's what their 20-day funding count is.
Okay, so Mr. Machado, what I'd like to ask us to do is that we firm up the language, including the things that we've discussed today. And before we vote on that tomorrow, we'll just do a brief recap of the things that we're adding, if that's okay. Chair Davis, are you okay with that?
That's a sound approach. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from board members on this? It sounds like we're going to approve the relocation. It looks like they are about 3 weeks out from having it CO. It does sound like that we are going to maintain the growth performance oversight and also make sure that they are compliant with 80 students at the end of their 20-day count. But we're just going to get that in language so that we can get eyeballs on that and make sure we're all on the same page. All right. Let's move to discussion. EICS 4 is the Hallbridge School's request to increase its enrollment for the 21-22 school year. Mr. Machado?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. This is a school that is located in Alamance County. It has been open since 2004. Currently serves grades 4 through 12. It's been a B school the last 5 years, and it has a graduation rate of greater than 95%. And as Ms. White mentioned, they want to increase their enrollment for not this next year, but the following year, 2021-22. So they'll be adding kindergarten through 3rd grade, which will be an increase of 271 students. They currently have a waiting list of 248. In their past 2020 lottery, they had 310 applicants for 64 seats. The school, again, has been a 4 through 12 for years, and their parents have been requesting for quite some time to have to be a complete K through 12. They went through a strategic planning year-long study and decided to put that into place, and they are in the process of building a loan. They've secured a USDA loan, so they'll be building a new building that will accommodate these extra students.
Okay, questions? Okay, seeing none, this is a discussion item, so it'll be back for us for a vote at the next meeting. Feel free to reach out to Mr. Machado and his team if you have a question. That will bring us to our last item, which is EICS 5. That's the NC Access annual review and subgrant recommendations for this year. And here to walk us through that is Jay Whalen.
Thank you, Ms. White. Good afternoon, board members. I'm going to be pretty brief, particularly around the annual review section, just given that this is discussion, and particularly around the annual review. There's no action necessary here, so we're happy to come back and present in more detail at any time around this. But to give the board just a brief update on the last year of the Access program, we also did mail hard copies of the full annual review. There's a kind of copy available to you in e-board, but we mailed hard copies, so hopefully that was helpful to you. And I'll just make one note that moving forward, starting later this summer, we will be partnering with the Friday Institute to do some external evaluation work of the program, so that will also be embedded in our annual reviews moving forward. So very briefly, we're about a year and a half, a little over a year and a half into the Access program timeline, our 5-year federal CSP grant, and coming up on the second cycle of subgrant awards, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But wanted to talk through some of the program highlights very briefly from the last year. I think one of the biggest highlights is the award of the $10 million supplement. So we were awarded an additional $10 million from the U.S. Department of Education last fall to support the expansion of the Access program by giving out 60 subgrants instead of 50 over the course of 5 years and expanding our fellowship program, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Last year, we also awarded, this board awarded 9 schools subgrants totaling $3.4 million. Those schools have just wrapped up their first year in the program. We also launched the NC Access Fellowship. Those fellows also just completed their first cohort. Unfortunately, we did have to cut some of the in-person sessions towards the end of the year due to the COVID-19 emergency, but felt like overall it was a successful year for what we were able to provide, and really looking forward to launching cohort 2. And we're also looking at ways to provide additional opportunities for those cohort 1 fellows who did have their fellowship cut short. And then one of the more exciting things about the program is we piloted a visiting fellows program. So with the $10 million supplemental funding, we're now able to bring, over the course of 5 years, an additional 40 school leaders from low-performing schools or schools that are not eligible for subgrants into that Access Fellowship and give them some high-quality professional development as well. Over the course of the first year, 800 high-quality seats have been added at North Carolina charter schools. Of those, about 250 are educationally disadvantaged students. And we'll talk about enrollment in just a little bit. But we expect that to go up considerably in the next couple of years as weighted lotteries are implemented. I apologize, you probably hear a future North Carolina public school student in the background right now. I won't spend a lot of time on the financial review. We are working on a reimbursement basis, so we review subgrantees' financials every month as they come in for reimbursement. But currently, we've expended, as of April 1st, I should say, we've expended just over $1.1 million of our total federal award. That has expanded in the last couple months and will go up significantly as you see the subgrant recommendation coming before you soon. And in terms of the subgrant recommendations, we allotted $3.4 million, as I mentioned, to the first round of subgrantees. This round will be much larger with the recommendations that are coming forward. Out of our total subgrant award, about $33.1 million has been allotted specifically for subgrants. So that is about 90% of our $36 million federal award. And in addition, we have some technical assistance funding, again, made possible by the supplement, where we were able to award some stimulus emergency funding to support some of our subgrantees in extending distance learning opportunities due to the challenges posed by the COVID-19 emergency. Objective 1, increase the number of educationally disadvantaged students attending high-quality charter schools. We're on track for that. Again, we were awarded 9 of the 6 subgrants. And if we just go straight to the next slide, you'll see the enrollment progress of our current subgrantees. Many schools have met or are close to meeting overall enrollment targets, and close to meeting the EDS enrollment targets as well. One note about that is that due to the timeline of awarding subgrants, most of the schools, actually in this case, none of the schools had actually implemented a weighted lottery for this past school year, so we expect those numbers to be significantly closer to their targets in the upcoming school year. For Objective 2, the NC Access Fellowship, we successfully launched Cohort 1 with 18 fellows, and then again piloted the Visiting Fellows program with 4 leaders. So we're looking forward to launching Cohort 2 and expanding that program this coming year. And then Objective 3, the dissemination of best practices. We're currently under development for the website that will house the NC Access School Leader portfolios, and we've hired a contractor that's supporting fellows in developing those portfolio entries. So again, upcoming is the second round of subgrantees, which we'll talk about in just a second. Launching Cohort 2 of the fellowship. We are, again, with the supplemental funding, able to send some of our fellows through the Want More, Do More Instructional Leader Cohort, and that is an instructional leader program hosted by Henderson Collegiate. And we are also one of, I believe, 3 state entities that are being profiled by the National Charter School Resource Center, particularly for our work around the fellowship, but to disseminate and share sort of our practices of the state and how we're implementing CSP funds. So I'll pause for a second. I know Dave Machado and our program coordinator, Dr. Barbara O'Neill, are also on the phone, so I'll let them say a few words about the program if they want to at this point, and then we can open it up for questions before we move into the subgrant recommendations.
Thank you, Jay. This is Dave Machado. I really want to emphasize the Fellows program that's part of this NC Access grant, and then the team decided to allow guest fellows to join, and this was strong leaders from low-performing schools were allowed to participate in the fellows, and this enabled these leaders of low-performing schools to see what our high-performing schools are doing. We feel like that was a great tool to help them get out of the low-performing status. It was a very innovative idea by the NC Access team. Really appreciate that thought and how successful it's been. And those leaders have added so much to the discussion. And now we're talking about developing a principal leaders cohort to try to develop new young leaders for our charter schools, and particularly leaders of color. So this NC Access is really having a big impact on charter schools in North Carolina. And I want to commend my NC Access team for the great work that they were doing.
I echo those sentiments, Mr. Machado. Great work.
This is Barbara O'Neill, and I'd just like to add that it was really an honor to be asked to be profiled by the National Charter School Organization, and that information will be coming out and be on their website at the end of the month. We were one of 7 schools to be, no, 5, I'm sorry, 5 to be profiled. And we will also participate in a webinar being held by them on July 21st to talk about what we did with COVID funding, with funding to assess schools during COVID. And that's because we awarded our own COVID stimulus money from our supplemental money. And subgrantees could one, they had to do a deep clean of their school before school start, and two, we asked them to use the remainder of the money to ensure that online access for their students, for everybody, to make sure everybody had a hotspot, access to internet, and a laptop to work from home. So each one of them got $30,000, and even our visiting fellows got $30,000. That's pretty much all I wanted to say right now.
Thank you, Ms. O'Neill.
So if there's no further questions on that right now, we can move right into the subgrant recommendations. As a reminder, subgrants are awarded to support the development, expansion, and replication of high-quality charter schools, demonstrating a commitment to increasing access for educationally disadvantaged students. So you were provided with individual subgrant recommendation reports, including a recommendation summary, the application, and all the evaluation rubrics. We do have a team of trained external evaluators to review, and we have a review committee of at least 3 members on every evaluation. In total, we're recommending 34 subgrants be recommended for approval, 6 planning and implementation, which are schools that have been approved but will be going into their planning year, 10 implementation only, which are for schools in years 1 to 3 of operation, and 18 expansion schools, which are high quality schools that have been open for more than 3 years and have met certain eligibility criteria in terms of performance. And in total, those 34 subgrants would amount to just over $17.4 million. So in the planning and implementation group, there are, again, 6 being awarded. 1 school is not being recommended for approval, and what you'll see in the chart is the name of the applicant, the year 5 educationally disadvantaged student enrollment of the school, and I'll just make a note that is year 5 of our program, not necessarily the total EDS enrollment that a school will have or grow beyond 5 years. That's just what we will be monitoring for their 5 years in the program, and the award recommendation. Another note you'll see in the recommendation reports themselves, schools, the awarded recommendation amount is a lot of times different than the requested award amount. This board will be voting on the recommended award amounts that we provided, and those are based on a number of factors, including the school growth and size of the overall population and EDS population, the strength of the application and based on the review committee's evaluation, as well as a number of financial, academic, and operational indicators from past performance. The implementation only group, again, will be awarding or recommending 10 be awarded. 1 is not recommended for approval. Blue Green has decided to relinquish their charter, so they will no longer be recommended for approval. And again, the names of the applicants and the award recommendations on this slide, and then the next slide is the second group of 10. And then finally, there are 18 expansion applicants that are being recommended for approval over the course of the next couple slides. I will note that we did receive letters of intent for replication, but because federal guidance says those schools need to apply for a replication to the authorizer before they can apply for a subgrant, they will be on a different timeline, and we'll have some information about that forthcoming over the next month or so. But the next steps would include approval of these recommendations by this board in August, and then we'll conduct budget reviews with each approved subgrantee, where we go through each line in the budget to approve allowability, and look for alignment to not only the NC Access program goals, but individual subgrant goals. We'll launch cohort 2 of the fellowship in August. And then, as I mentioned, the request for replication applicants will come later this fall. And so again, I know I went through that quickly. I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, we'll be back in front of this board in August for action. But are there any questions that we can answer right now?
Thank you, Mr. Whalen and Dr. O'Neill. So appreciate, and Mr. Machado, this incredible report of the good work that's being done. Questions from my board members for regarding this particular grant and the way it's been implemented in schools across our state? Okay, hearing none, then that will be back before us for action next month. And Mr. Chair, that will conclude the Education, Innovation, and Charter School Committee report for this morning.
Thank you, Ms. White. Let's go ahead and proceed with the school turnaround committee before we break.
Yes, sir. I'm, of course, Amy White, and this time I'm before you as chair of the special committee on school turnaround. And for at least a couple of more days, I share that responsibility with Mr. J.B. Buxton, who has provided excellent and amazing leadership and direction to this committee. Today, we're before you with an NC STAR update, and excited to allow Mr. Alessandra Montanari and Dr. Lane Mills from Wilson County Schools as a guest, and Dr. Cheryl Wilson from Wilson County Schools to talk us through some of the amazing work that's being done there. And so with that, I will turn it over to you guys.
Good afternoon, Chairman Davis, Vice Chairman Duncan, Superintendent Johnson, and board members. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. My name is Alessandro Montanari, and I'm the Assistant Director of District and Regional Support. The very next slide will just show you the connections between what we're about to present and the State Board Strategic Plan. And then from there, I know you've heard Dr. Cynthia Martin, my director, show our mission statement of District and Regional Support, just reminding everyone of our desire that every child in North Carolina have equitable access to a meaningful, sound, basic education. And as was pointed out by Ms. White, today's presentation has to do with NC STAR. This is our funnel, our 4 levels, as we support schools throughout the state. And NC STAR plays a role in every one of these colors, every one of these levels. In statewide services, just so that in case everyone doesn't know, NC STAR is the school improvement planning tool that's used by over 2,500 schools in our state. At the diagnostic services level, NC STAR is one of the many data points that is looked by Dr. Silver and her amazing team that conduct needs assessments throughout the state, and is also the critical tool that's used for DPI to provide feedback to low-performing schools per statute. In the strategic reform level, you all have had the wonderful Ms. Julie Garver talk about Restart Schools, and NC STAR is used by Restart Schools to incorporate those flexibilities that they've chosen into their school improvement plan and also submit their annual report to the state. And then last but not least, intensive interventions. Our regional case managers and the regional support team uses NC STAR to have those critical conversations that are sometimes needed to assist those districts where intensive intervention is required. Just a reminder to everyone of the Wested Leandro report. In the Leandro recommendations, they talk about the importance of all of us providing support to high poverty schools by providing that technical assistance and school improvement, that leadership coaching, and the scaling up of those evidence-based practices, all of which is part of the work that NC STAR does for us at the state. So what is NC STAR? NC STAR is a web-based tool that is used throughout North Carolina. As I pointed out earlier, it's being used by 2,500 schools. It's 2,500 plus. It started out in 2016. That's when it rolled out. So it's been out there for about 4 years. And we also now have a district version of all this where we have 16 different districts that you also use it for district improvement planning. During the 4 years this has been out there, we've been able to train over 20,000 educators face-to-face. And one of the things that we have pointed out from day one when NC STAR rolled out in 2016 is that what we've learned in school transformation and improving schools, that it's never about programs. It's always about the people in the building. It is the adults, from the teachers to the principals to district leaders. And we are very lucky to have two amazing district leaders later here today with us to talk to you about their success in Wilson County schools. NC Star is simply that tool to get us to where we need to go. It keeps us organized and it keeps us focused. But we always get asked why. Why was NC Star created? I know the board has heard the term NC Star used several times. So it got created back in 2016 because of a need. We wanted to continue supporting our schools and take everything we had learned for the past decade of supporting schools and transforming schools in North Carolina. And because of the cuts in human capital at the department, we felt that an online virtual option would be the best way to continue that work. So if you're not familiar with, if you go to the next slide, DPI used to have a framework for action, and this was the framework that was followed by our coaches when coaches went out to support schools. And it is what we've done with NC Star is we've taken this framework and built it into the system so that when schools do their school improvement planning, they focus on these, what we call in NC Star, these key indicators to improving and transforming schools. Now, the reason we've done that is because of the success of the framework. For those of you that remember when Judge Manning called out the 66 high schools and North Carolina turnaround got started, it was then that the framework got created. And we had tremendous success in moving those schools in a positive direction. In addition to that data, there's a couple more slides of data here. It shows you the success that the framework had in moving schools in the right direction. And then we ended up having Race to the Top, where indeed our staff did multiply by 6 because of the resources that Race to the Top gave us. And we were able to focus on the 118 schools in the bottom 5%. Now, when you looked at the success of that, in 2016-17, only 15 of those 118 were in the bottom 5%. And that's the reason that we said this framework is important. We need to make sure the schools at least have it, and at least the schools try to follow it when they're planning for it, and that's when NC Star got created. Now, in NC Star, it's not known as the framework. In NC Star, it's known as the 12 key indicators, and these are it right there. We ask all schools in North Carolina that use NC Star to start by assessing these 12 key components. Now, when we talk to administrators across North Carolina and we talk to district leaders across the state, I think everyone looks at this list and understands that these are just basic, effective practices that every great school should have. And that's the starting point for us in NC Star. For those of you that NC Star is new, this is just a quick vocabulary review. Indicators, you've heard me talk about 12 key indicators. Anytime you hear anyone talk about indicators in NC Star, those are research-based effective practices. As I mentioned, there's a school system and there's a district side to this. The school system has 130 indicators that they can pick and choose from, 130 different effective practices that they can work on. And the districts, if they decide to do the district planning piece, has about 36. Every single indicator has a wise ways document, and that is the research. So if anyone has ever had a question as to why do we want to do this indicator, why is this an effective practice in schools, every single one has a research document, which if anyone's ever done a dissertation, it looks like a little lit review of about 4 to 6 pages. Last but not least, the other 2 words there that you'll hear schools mention a lot are the terms objective and actions. It was kind of interesting when I heard Mr. James Ford talk earlier about the strategic plan getting some actionable steps. Same thing goes in NC Star. The actions are those actionable steps. It's the creation of and the monitoring of those action steps, which are most important to school improvement planning. We constantly tell our schools it is what takes the school from point A to point C. So those are just some quick definitions of the words you'll encounter if you ever speak to a school or district about NC Star. NC Star contains 5 different ways to get into the system. The district access is the only one I'll spend some time on here because the main purpose of that district access is to provide schools with coaching comments. Unfortunately, with the lack of human capital for us to support and improve schools, what we've done with NC Star is we've built that coaching feature into the instrument so that districts are able to try to provide coaching support to their schools. Sometimes being a principal or an assistant principal in our schools is a lonely job, and that small little piece of coaching support goes a long way to closing those gaps that might exist. So why the strong emphasis and the focus on improvement planning the past 4 years? It has made it not only the thing about human capital, but it's also a big important piece for all schools across our state. We need to have a plan in place that we know exactly where we need to go. You've heard other people sometimes talk about plans as your school's GPS, and it tells the school exactly what streets they need to be taking to get to that final destination. And that's exactly what the importance is of that improvement planning. Now, one of the things that schools and districts quickly find out when they start using NC Star is that NC Star is not your traditional school improvement plan. You go to the next slide, please, Deanna. Thank you. And you can jump to the other one. In fact, traditionally, when we mention school improvement plans, this is what most schools or educators think of. It's unfortunately this plan that gets approved by a board, and it's unfortunately sits in a shelf somewhere because every 2 years it gets revised and edited per statute. Now, we know this happens throughout the state because we even surveyed the state of North Carolina in 2015, and if you look at the data on the next slide, when we asked principals across our state, how often do you revise or edit that school improvement plan, and this was back in 2015, we found that over 80% were very limitedly looking at those plans so the term continuous improvement, where we're constantly checking our plans and making modifications and making edits as required, was not really happening. And I'm happy to say that this has completely changed with the NC Star tool across our state. We can go to the next slide. Trying to go fast so you can listen to Wilson County Schools here. One of the big changes in NC Star has been, instead of focusing so much on your traditional SMART goals, the focus is on practice. It's on these practices that will help us achieve those SMART goals. And then the other big part of this, and everyone notices this when they start using the instrument, is that all 130 indicators, all 12 key indicators, they're all about adult actions. It is the adults that need to do certain things for student learning to go up. And when I mention the term adults here, it's all adults, all stakeholders involved in education, everything from the teacher level to the administrator level to district level to community leaders. I mean, those are the people that matter and the people that got to do these research-based practices effectively for us to get student achievement to go up. One of the other big components of NC Star is this idea of distributive leadership. And the reason this was built into the instrument is because of what we've learned in transforming schools in North Carolina, that we've had a lot of schools in the past that have had dynamic educators, dynamic leaders, and have transformed themselves. But unfortunately, when that person leaves the building, that building goes back down to where it was. So distributive leadership is built in through the instrument. This is no longer a one-person plan or a two-person plan. It is truly the school's plan. And what we start seeing is that the actual NC Star plan is not only talked about as in the school improvement team meetings, but it's now even talked about in faculty meetings, it's talked about in PLCs. This is really now driving and guiding the adults that are in the building on an every week or monthly basis. Last but not least, we have tried to make NC Star a one-stop shop. I think schools and districts across the state, superintendents across the state know that we are constantly listening to what they want from us and how to make NC Star an easier tool and something that makes their work easier. So for example, we've connected everything to the comprehensive needs assessment dimensions. We did a lot of work with MTSS and Angel and her team. In fact, one of the documents that we've provided with you is a crosswalk with the FAMS tool, and we've done professional development on seeing those connections. And then the last big work that we did was with the digital learning group, connecting everything to the focus areas, from digital learning competencies of administrators to digital learning competencies of teachers. We also, because our state superintendent, one of his desires was personalized learning, we pushed personalized learning hard in the instrument and worked with 4 different districts across North Carolina in creating personalized learning indicators for schools and personalized learning indicators for districts as well, to help with their planning on those initiatives. So the success that we've had with it. So I can show you 2 years of data, because obviously we don't have testing data this past year. But in 17-18, we had 505 low-performing schools. We had 186 exit the low-performing list after 1 year. And over half of those schools were showing improvement, whether it be moving a letter grade or in the right direction. In fact, when you talk to those principals, they basically tell us, we're finally having the conversations that needed to be happening in the school. We're finally using that time wisely. We're finally talking about the practices that will help us achieve our SMART goals, instead of just focusing on the SMART goals themselves. The following year, we had similar data, and that's the very next slide. And just to talk to you more about this type of success, luckily today we have 2 incredible leaders, 2 incredible educators with us, Dr. Mills, Superintendent Mills from Wilson County Schools, and Associate Superintendent Dr. Cheryl Wilson. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the amazing turnaround that has happened in Wilson County, but in only 4 years under their leadership, they've gone from 13 low-performing schools to only 4. They are incredible instructional leaders, and I can say that publicly everywhere I go, and take it away.
Thank you, everyone. We're glad to be here. Alessandro, the check's in the mail for you. Appreciate that feedback. And I'd ask for that in writing to share with my board later. You know, I think the key for us is the comment earlier about it's always about people. And so when Alessandro asked about could we share what we're doing, it's really not fancy, but it does involve all the information he just shared. So what we wanted to do today was just share a little bit about our background, walk you through what the process has been. Again, none of this is fancy, and just try and share a little bit about our path and where we're headed. It's been an odd year, of course, with the closure and the lack of data, but I arrived here in Wilson in 2016, and we were a low-performing district. We had 13 out of 24 schools that were not where they needed to be, and this is a slide that I use a lot with my principals and other folks, but I heard a lot about how this is the way we've done things. We've always done it this way, and that is a dangerous phrase, especially in school systems. You know, we had a lot of folks that were busy, but there was really no alignment in what we were doing. Folks were working hard, but it wasn't hitting the right ones. And we really focused on relationships, conversations, instructional practice, looking at our data, and being focused on that. We went from about 90th in the state out of the school districts in North Carolina to most recently 58th. And our overall proficiency went from around 47% to 57% in that period of time. So we've got the largest gains in grade level proficiency of any school district for the last 2 or 3 years, not counting this year with there is no data, but and we focused on instructional practice. It did not cost us. There's no special program for this. There's no special consultant. There's no one coming over the ridge on the horses and to bring the solution in a package to us. We just had to do the work. So what I wanted to do today with Dr. Wilson, who has been right by my side as we've gone through this, is to share a little bit about what our process has been, how we use these tools. And again, Alessandro will be very quiet, but he has been with us through this whole process, came in, did a lot of the training, helped our principals gain trust in it, and because they've all seen the latest and greatest information coming out, and that's a big part of it. But I'll turn it over to Dr. Wilson, let her share a little bit with you.
components that we needed towards the total school improvement. This slide identifies many of those components that you see. We used the NC STAR indicators to assist us in determining where we needed to start. I'd like to point out the MTSS, or as in the NC STAR, calls it a tiered instructional framework, is centered in the middle. It is the heart of our journey because it focuses on students. It focuses on students talking about the data and the conversations that we had about student learning and how we meet their needs through instruction, curriculum, and the environment. Some of the hexagons that you see there on the right, two of those are strengthening leadership, building teacher capacity. Those all helped us grow. On the top right-hand side, the database decisions, they helped us be able to assess, create, and monitor. And then, of course, it's always important to do the monitoring and the feedback. In the next slide, you'll see some work that we did in Wilson County Schools. We drill down into our data as it becomes available. And so these are actual documents that we used. The frame on the right is the analysis, interpretation, and implications. We interpret and determine those implications towards teaching and learning. And the image on this left is just one example of the terms that we use to make it relevant to our leadership teams. The image on the right shows us some of the questions that are asked in the comprehensive needs assessment, and you'll see the highlighted sections because our accountability team takes the data that we receive and puts it into a data warehouse. And then our schools can focus their time on delving into the data rather than having to search for the data. On the next slide, you see some images of the hard work that our leadership teams have done during their comprehensive needs assessments. These data questions are more than just performance-based. The image on the left shows some answers that would be about the performance, but you also see the image on the right that we delve into the discipline, the attendance, and perception data, all again focused on the teaching and learning of our students as well as our staff. Our school leadership teams revisit their comprehensive needs assessment as the new data arrives. As Alessandro said earlier in the presentation, it used to be the 3-ring binder we put on a shelf. We would review it every year or every couple of years, and not with this particular tool. We're constantly asking, what do the data say? What does it mean? Conversations always grounded on data about teaching and learning. The next slide shows an example of that indicator, the WISE ways. At the top of the WISE ways, you'll see the indicator listed. The top image shows what the explanation, what questions that someone might have, and the bottom image shows the references. In Wilson County Schools, we break down those indicators, just like a teacher would break down the standards that she might or he might be teaching. We go into the references and the resources to try to get a little bit more information when we need that kind of information. On the next slide, you see an example of some of our breaking apart the indicators. You have the top image on the left and the bottom image on the right, some of the work that we've done. On the bottom left, we have an example of how it will look and what will it look like and sound like when it's fully met. And the same is up in the top right-hand corner.
You know, a big part about these indicators and these breaking them apart in the conversations are things we had to do to develop trust with our leadership teams and our principals and our school-based folks. Just having the information in the electronic format doesn't do anything. It's no different than the notebooks that Alessandro showed. It would just be a transfer, and it's not really changing behavior. a lot of what we do deals with building relationships and trust with our teams so that when we are talking about what our goals are and we're talking about what our objectives and breaking those apart so you can see them and touch them and understand what it looks like when it's done right is through time and mileage is what I tell the principal. We're doing instructional rounds with our principals. We're out in the classrooms having those conversations, and it's not evaluative. It's feedback and sharing, and it informs us about things we need to be looking at and things we should do better. But also, I've required the principals to do rounds at other schools, and I've made folks kind of uncomfortable. Our high school folks would love to stay in their buildings all day. I made them go to elementary schools because instruction is instruction, and getting out of that comfort zone, and they're leading their own rounds within their buildings now. And again, these are the kind of things that the data is always there, and I believe data is important. I'm a data nerd, analytics guy, I love it. But it's got to be about what the information is and what the numbers mean and what they don't mean. These were about instruction and how it drives the numbers, and that takes care of itself. So when we started this, it was a lot of time and task of explaining the process, taking away the evaluative piece of it so that folks would share, because without that, we weren't going anywhere. And so we spent the time and did the groundwork to do that, and it paid off. We kept track of where we were. We made it a family thing to be competitive around other districts and where we stacked up, and it became a goal that we all shared. And no one really kept score with each other more than they normally did with the usual jokes and cutting up with everybody. But we just took it on as we're not going to be where we were, or we're not going back there. And so what do we need to do? And those conversations have paid off for times like this when we're in unknown circumstances. And so we can pick up the phone or we can say, go figure it out. And they know the expectations. So a lot of what we're talking about, again, this does not cost money. This is not a paid program. We're not spending extra for consultants. So it comes down to expectations, conversation, and a focus on instruction. But the rounds were really key. They were very, very critical.
Dr. Mills is correct in the idea about the rounds. We used the rounds to help us move forward. And that's what you see on the image on the right. What are the puzzle pieces that we used in the rounds? We determined a problem of practice. We went into classrooms to visit, and then we would come back and have conversations. The fancy word may be debrief, but we just had some conversations about what we saw in those classrooms. At the image in the top the top left-hand corner, you see an example of after we had some of those conversations, because I think it's important to note that some of the next steps and the improvements don't necessarily have to come from the school level or even in the classroom level. This is an example in the top left of a change that we made at the district level based on some visits that we had made into the classroom. We needed to have some clarification in our curriculum frameworks, so we added photos, we added examples and resources in our district level curriculum resources. The bottom left image shows some examples of comments. I mentioned earlier that we have lots of different supports. One level of support that we have is that we have assigned a person from the district level schools, and they are responsible to that school. They meet with the schools on a monthly basis. They make coaching comments in the NC STAR tool, and there's a two-way communication. And that's very important, because then they see that the work that we're doing at the district level is not in isolation. It's really as a team effort. The next slide shows some additional monitoring and continuous support documents that we have. The image on the left is an example of our snapshots that we call them. They're short little snippets of time that we go into classrooms. You see a list of some of our instructional practices that we in Wilson County believe are important. The image in the middle shows a small set of 3 questions on a rubric that as we use to monitor. And we go in, Dr. Mills talked about principals going to other schools. We have teachers, we have senior staff. I mean, everyone in our district is involved in these instructional rounds. And we take those snapshots, the results of those, and you'll see what comes out on the 2 images on the right. We take that information, we disaggregate that based on our schools. We share with our principals and our assistant principals, our district staff, how many visits that we've gone into the classrooms, where we're ranking. Dr. Mills mentioned about the competition part. We really are looking at which schools are working on a particular problem of practice, which ones are improving, how can we work together to move forward. In our next slide, we have some comments. After we had done some instructional rounds, we asked the principals some of what they thought about it. And these are actual comments that what some of our principals have said.
So for us, NC STAR was a great framework from us to build upon and use as part of our toolbox for improving instruction, improving outcomes. We found the coaching feedback and the organization of it really worked well for us and got away from the static paper documents that, while good, it just weren't easy enough to work quickly off of and be nimble with, and we needed that. We didn't have time to wait. And so what we've seen is we've used kind of all those pieces to engage the conversation about instruction. What does it look like? How do you know? How does it working? And that framework, and again, Alessandro had a big part in that. He came down and worked with our principals and our staffs multiple times, was always available, and did a great job of putting it in very concrete and practical terms for folks. So it was clear what we were doing, what we were focusing on. And we just kept starting small and building upon it and scaffolding as we went. And so, it's just another tool in the toolbox, but it's very effective for us. And one of those things where everyone was like, oh, here's another process, and the groan comes up. But as you can see from the feedback, they didn't mind it. That they see the connection and made it part of their routine. So it wasn't something you just have to do. So we've still got plenty of work to do. We've still got gaps here and there. We've got some holes to fill. And we're not where we want to be at everywhere. But we know where we're headed, and we know what's working for us, and we've got a plan. And part of that is this tool set and some of the information that's available to all school districts. So any questions for us? We really appreciate a chance to have chat with you today.
Dr. Mills, Dr. Wilson, this is Amy White. I just want to thank you for, one, your patience as we had a lengthy morning of information, two, the incredible, amazing work that you are doing in Wilson County to turn around your schools. I know that if we had data available, I would love to see the climate data at all of your schools, because I know when folks work in a team environment, success is inevitable, and you and your leaders are responsible for that. Colleagues, I would love to have a lengthy discussion about this because it's exciting work, and on behalf of J.B. Buxton and myself, we want to tell you that we know that this work is critical and is going to be a key portion of the work that we need to continue to do for turnaround across our state. But we do have a considerable amount of work to do in the rest of the afternoon. So unless anybody has a pressing comment, I am going to bring this conversation to a close. and thank everyone for their time and their work on this particular agenda item today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Chair Davis, I turn the floor back over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ms. White, and I'll add my thanks to Dr. Mills and Dr. Wilson for that terrific work in Wilson County. We have much to learn from you. Let's take a short break. We do have some outside guests that are going to be speaking with us on our next item, so let's be back together by 1:40.